ISA registered valuer, certified FA and FD. CA Vivek Nemetia has an experience of more than 17 years and is presently a partner at Messrs. S.J. Kisan. He has also completed his diploma in economics and BSc in management from the University of London and Bachelor's of Commerce honors from St. Xavier's College, Kolkata. He is a qualified CISA and a holder of diploma in information system audit from ICAI. He has also completed certified courses of ICAI on valuation, international taxation, IFRS, and forensic accounting and fraud detection. He is currently serving as a special invitee in Accounting Standard Board and a member of IndAS IFRS Advisory Group. He has served as a co-opted member of the Expert Advisory Committee of ICAI. He has also been authorized by IBBI as a registered valuer for securities or financial assets, becoming the first to attain this qualification in the Eastern region. This is a proud moment for us. Today, he will take on Caro and Schedule 3 today. Now I move to another speaker today. Our young and learned speaker today, CS Anita Bed, Vice President, Vinod Kothari Consultant. CS Anita Bed is a commerce graduate from the University of Calcutta and an associate member of the Institute of Company Secretary of India. She is currently associated with Vinod Kothari Consultant as VP. Anita has done comprehensive writing and speaking on financial sector regulation. Several of her articles and viewpoints have been published and quoted by well-known publications, magazines, and websites such as Economic Times, Financial Express, Money Life, etc. She has also been a faculty at various educational courses and seminars organized by the ICSI, ICAI, and other professional institutes on topics related to Nbfcs, corporate laws, etc. She will take on today the Nbfc matters. Now, without delaying, I would like to request our first speaker, C. Vivek Neotia, to start his deliberation. Thank you.
A very good morning and a happy Sunday to everyone, to all the delegates present. Thank you, Rajesh Bhaiya, for inviting me. Thank you, Sandeep ji. Thank you, VIP Chartered Accountants, for inviting me to deliberate on Companies Auditors Report Order 2020. And a very warm welcome to my co-speaker as well, Ms. Ankita Bad. She will be speaking on a very relevant topic, which is NBFCs. And all of us know the kind of regulations which an NBFC is subjected to. And as auditors, we as auditors are required to have very strong auditing skills when it comes to reviewing the regulations which an NBFC is expected to comply with. Nonetheless, even in smaller companies or private limited companies, new requirements under the Caro and Schedule 3 have put onerous responsibilities upon us as auditors with respect to the disclosure requirements, with respect to the way ROCs have become active or hyperactive with respect to the non-disclosures in companies. And we as auditors being subjected to notices being issued by ROCs, we as professionals have to come up either as employed chartered accountants with the industry or as practicing chartered accountants. We need to ensure that we train the clients to be aware of the requirements of the disclosures, as well as improve the disclosure quotient of the company, so as to say that the compliance improves to the extent possible. I'll just share my screen. And let us make this an interactive session. Any issues, any questions which each of us have may be deliberated on a clause by clause basis, and I may be interfered in between as and when the seminar progresses. So it's more interactive, and we can discuss certain issues which all of us face on a regular basis. Certain issues were identified by Rajesh ji in the course of the introduction of the topic, We'll try to discuss those issues as well as any other issues which, since we are in the mid of the audit season, any issue which you may have with it helps both of us to improve on and deliberate and arrive at a conscious view. I hope my screen is visible.
Yes, visible way. Yes.
So, this Caro 2020 is applicable for all auditors report issued under Section 143 commencing on or after 1st April 2021. So this financial year 21-22 for which we are issuing a report is the first year of Caro 2020. And there are significant additional disclosure requirements which have been put as part of the Caro. Along with the Caro amendments which the Ministry of Corporate Affairs has brought out, there have been significant disclosure improvement requirements in Schedule 3 as well. Even for a small company wherein Caro 2020 is not applicable, those disclosure requirements under Schedule 3 will continue to be applicable. And we have to ensure that even if this particular item is not reported under Caro 2020, those items are disclosed under as part of Schedule 3 disclosures. Disclosures relating to loans and advances given on demand, disclosures related to strike of companies, aging of debtors, defaults, whether there's a willful defaulter or not. These disclosures actually ask us to go into mere disclosures, mere accounts, mere audit, and have and make a, and gives a forensic touch to the accounts being audited. These disclosures essentially make the financials more transparent, and the regulators or the bankers or the other stakeholders would have much more information while analyzing the financial statements before extending or in any loan or investing in the company. Now, even in consolidated financial statements wherein Caro 2016 was not applicable, Caro 2020 has been made applicable to consolidated financial statements as well. There is only one clause which is applicable to Caro for consolidated financial statements, and some mere compilation of Caro of all the components which are consolidated as part of CFS. Now, Caro has modified various clauses, particularly in respect of loans given, loans taken, in respect of investments, in respect of bank loans. And there have been new clauses which have been inserted, particularly with respect to how an internal audit, whether the internal audit is appropriate for whistleblower companies. We'll deal with each of them one by one. And the guidance note has been recently revised. So we should be aware of the guidance note, and we should look into the requirements of the guidance note. There is a publication which is available in respect of Caro 2020 issued by Chamber of Tax Consultants, which is quite a decent publication and gives us illustrative clauses, illustrative reporting as well. So I think if anyone wants to purchase that publication, that really helps us to improve our disclosure requirements when it comes to Caro 2020. So that is there. Now, when we look at look at ourselves as auditors, the question that arises in the mind of most of us is why Caro 2020? Because Caro 2016 was already there. Now this Caro 2020, which has been brought out, just increases our reporting responsibilities. The commensurate increase in audit fees is never there, and audit is probably the most underpaid profession, so as to say, considering the risk involved that we have when we are signing the financial statements. So, of course, we as auditors should embrace Caro. The expectations from the stakeholders have increased significantly over the last 15 years, 2 decades. The requirement of how the funds received have been deployed, whether the funds have been diverted for unproductive purposes or to group companies, considering the recent corporate failures such as ILFS, Satyam, Enron, we as auditors need to look at how these funds are properly deployed by the company. These corporate failures, which are sudden, create a lot of challenges and disturbs the ecosystem, the financial ecosystem. And therefore, as auditors who are supposed to be watchdogs or bloodhounds, the debate continues. Nonetheless, we need to ensure that those corporate failures are arrested or identified in the earliest. There are increasing instances of fraud which are there, and again there are whistleblower complaints which are being raised in respect of various listed companies. These whistleblower complaints again should be looked at by the auditors to understand whether these would affect the true and fair view of the financial statements. There are related party transactions which we as auditors always need to keep an open eye on and report on that. So this Caro 2020 amendments essentially provide a lot of clarity on our rule and provide an objective reporting requirement under the Caro 2020, so as to ensure that relevant information is being shared with the stakeholders concerned. So this presentation is mostly on Caro. What I will do first is probably will discuss certain key amendments which are there in Schedule 3, and then we can probably go ahead and discuss the clause-wise analysis of Caro 2020. So one point which was raised by Rajesh ji as well was on respect of the rounding off. Now there is a mandatory rounding off based on how the total income is there, how much of the total income is there. So the rounding off is not based on turnover but on total income. So we need to be mindful of that fact, and the rounding off is mandatory under the Companies Act now. So that rounding off was not required until the last year. It was merely optional, and we used to disclose the entire full figures in the financial statements, which we of course use it for the purpose of return filing. Now the rounding off is mandatory for all companies under the Companies Act reporting. And when we are rounding off, it is thousands or lakhs that reporting that we round it off to. And rounding off is mandatory based on how much is the total income of the particular company concerned. Even in a small company, therefore, rounding off would be required to be done. Challenges would come in wherein we are preparing the financial statements for the purpose of filing the return. We of course would have to have a separate column which may be hidden for the purpose of disclosure, and based on that we file the return. We round it off on the basis of that column, and that those two columns which are prepared under the Companies Act are visible for the purpose of Companies Act, reporting. Now for the purpose of tax audit, we of course will attach the same set of financial statements which we upload under the Companies Act. Will not attach the financial statements with the full figures. That would not be a correct approach. The requirement under Form 3CD or the tax audit report is to attach the financial statements which are audited under other statute. So the financial statements which have been audited under other statute need to be annexed to the tax audit report, and not the financial statements with the full figures. For the purpose of filing the return, for the purpose of filing the ITR 6, for the purpose of filling in the balance sheet and PL information, we of course will have to fill in the full figures, for which we need to have necessary backup for the purpose of filling in the information in the ITR. Another disclosure requirement which is there is in respect of aging of trade receivables and trade payables. Again, the aging requirement under trade receivables and payables, we'll of course have to look at not only current year data, we have to look at the previous year data as well. So the aging has to be disclosed for the current year as well as the previous year. As per the Companies Act requirement, Schedule 3 requirement, previous year figures are compulsory to be disclosed. So the aging of the current as well as the previous year need to be disclosed as part of the Schedule 3 disclosures. A question which arises here is what is we again have to categorize the trade receivables as disputed and undisputed. And these dispute, how do we identify whether a particular trade receivable is disputed or undisputed? Whether the dispute will be restricted to party not paying the amount without any reason, because of maybe insolvency, because of a legal, because of they do not have the capacity to pay, that would not fall under the definition of dispute. Dispute would mean a reason because of which the party is not paying. Reason could be operational reason, should not be an operational reason. Reason should be a legal reason. The party has to dispute the payment. The reason, if the dispute is with respect to the quantum or the timing, that forms part of the dispute under the disclosure requirements under the trade receivables. So if the vendor or the customer has disputed, for example, in case of a vendor dispute, we will of course look at why the party is not paying, whether the quality supplied by us is defective, whether the party has not agreed to the acceptance of the goods, whether the goods have actually reached the vendor or not, reached the customer or not. So on that basis, we will identify whether a particular dispute is existing or not. Again, in consolidated financial statements, we'll have to aggregate the disclosures in respect of all the subsidiaries for the purpose of reporting of trade receivable and consolidated financial statements. As part of the aging requirement, we also need to disclose whether there are unbilled dues. If there is an unbilled dues, that needs to be disclosed separately, and that would not form part of the aging. Where the due date is not available, we'll take the transaction date as the basis of identifying the aging for the purpose of trade receivables. Similar requirements exist for trade payables as well, although the aging buckets are different in trade receivables and aging buckets are different in trade receivables. So we need to look at the aging buckets as per the requirements of Schedule 3 and appropriately dispose. Another area where aging has been introduced is with respect to capital work in progress. Again, this requirement has been introduced to ensure that companies which are showing expenses under capital work in progress for a long time are duly presented to the stakeholders. The reasons for delays in project should be duly indicated in the financial statements as part of the disclosure. Where the projects temporarily suspended are they need the category of projects temporarily suspended need to be disclosed as a separate line item in the financial and as part of the aging requirement. And in respect and the aging requirement would essentially take into account when the capital work in progress came into existence. So we need to be aware of all the capital work in progress. What is the nature of project being undertaken? What is the total budget? Why is there a cost overrun? Why is there a time overrun? And what is the expected date of completion of each nature of project? So these disclosure requirements again would be significant in terms of how as we as auditors look at capital work in progress. We have always applied the necessary audit procedures when it comes to fixed assets, CWIP, but the challenge has been we have not gone ahead and asked uncomfortable questions to the management as to why there is a time overrun, why is there a cost overrun, and if there is a time and cost overrun, when is the project expected to be complete? When how much extra cost is required to be incurred by the particular project? These disclosures would ensure more transparency and ensure that the management commits to the requirements which are there as part of the disclosure. Again, one more disclosure requirement is with respect to transactions with strike-off companies. So these strike-off companies disclosures would be limited to the 5 categories which is forming part of Schedule 3. These disclosures would ensure that we have to evaluate whether the customers or the vendors or the investments with the company has are actually existing in the Ministry of Corporate Affairs database. That's a difficult task, so as to say, because we have to identify each and every company and look at the current status of the particular company, whether it's a strike-off company or not. These disclosures essentially mean that we have to have increased working paper requirements with respect to how we perform the audit procedures with respect to whether the company is strike off or not. We have to look at the master data of the particular company and ensure that when we print to a PDF, a timestamp is there. We understand whether a particular company has been struck off or not. Again, there are certain names which are very similar. Names are changed sometimes of the particular company. It's become sometimes difficult for us to identify the company, and therefore that list there should be a internal control available with the company as well to identify such companies and ensure that those companies are appropriately reported at reasonable periods of time by the company. So these are the primarily major amendments. Apart from that, I think the disclosure requirements with respect to cryptocurrency would not be applicable in most of the companies and 99% of the companies. There would be disclosure requirements of Benami, which are there as part of the Caro as well, which we'll discuss. There are no other disclosures with respect to charge creation, etc. are there. Those are not significant in terms of how we draw the financial statements, but merely reporting requirements. Not getting into those individual disclosures. Any issues with respect to Schedule 3 disclosures, we can discuss that, and then we can go ahead with the Caro reporting requirement. whether bill submitted not accepted by the party comes under disputed debtors. No, so bill submitted not accepted by the party would not come under the disputed debtors. It's only when there is a dispute. There has to be an existence of a dispute before a particular item comes under the category of debtors. If the customer has accepted the goods, there is the contract is complete by itself. Just because the bill has not been accepted does not mean that there is a dispute. Dispute has to be certain tangible, certain event which creates a dispute. Just because an acceptance of the bill is not there, the dispute does not mean that there is an existence of a dispute. Any other questions or concerns with respect to the disclosure requirements in Schedule 3? हाँ अनिल जी बोलिए ना.
विवेक
हाँ अनिल जी. हेलो.
जी,
हाँ 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 अनिल जी बोलिए.
हाँ विवेक जी, अच्छा रेशियो का जो डिस्क्लोजर है,
हाँ
हेलो,
हाँ हाँ
रेशियो का डिस्क्लोजर में जो वेरिएंस दिखाना है हम लोग को, हाँ
हाँ.
वेरिएंस दिखाना है ना, मोर देन 25% के बारे में एक्सप्लेनेशन मांग रहा है.
हाँ
तो इसमें मैंने हम एक इन्फोसिस का बैलेंस शीट देख रहे थे. वो लोग क्या कर रहा है कि अगर मान लीजिए एनपी रेशियो लास्ट ईयर 10% था और इस बार 15% है. अगर हम इन कंपेरिजन टू लास्ट ईयर जो उसका लैंग्वेज है करते हैं तो 50% रेशियो में डिफरेंस आ गया.
हाँ
10
एकदम.
से 15 हो गया.
हाँ
लेकिन इन्फोसिस वाला उसको 5% बता रहा है, 10 to 15 ओनली.
नहीं मेरे हिसाब से देखिए 25% का मतलब 10 से 12.5 से ऊपर हुआ.
वही होना चाहिए ना.
हाँ मेरे हिसाब से तो वही हुआ. बट आई एम नॉट गेटिंग इनटू हाउ इन्फोसिस इज डिस्क्लोज्ड, मतलब वेदर इट इज करेक्ट और
हम
नॉट.
अब नहीं कई एक कंपनी में हम देख रहे हैं वो चीज दिखला रहा है वो लोग.
हाँ हाँ हाँ
मैक्सिमम में वो दिखला रहा है वो 50% ही उसको 10 to 15 को 50% दिखला रहा है.
हाँ.
बट इन्फोसिस या और 2-3 बैलेंस शीट हम देख रहे थे उसमें वो लोग उसको डिफरेंस दिखला रहा है. 10 to 15 को 5% बोल रहा है.
नहीं नहीं मेरे हिसाब से तो इट इज मोर देन 25% इन माय व्यू.
मोर देन 25% होना
हाँ
चाहिए.
हाँ अदरवाइज तो 10 सपोज करिए ग्रॉस प्रॉफिट 10% है फिर तो 35% तक हमको दिखाने का दरकार ही नहीं है. ये तो
हाँ
कोई
दिखाने का दरकार ही नहीं है.
लॉजिक ही नहीं हुआ. कोई लॉजिक नहीं.
वर्डिंग भी जो वहां बोल रहा है इन कंपेरिजन टू लास्ट ईयर.
हाँ हाँ हाँ
ठीक है, थैंक यू.
हाँ. हाउ डू वी अराइव एट द क्रेडिट? और किसी को भी कोई क्वेश्चन अगर होना तो एनीवन कैन जस्ट raise their hand so I can unmute them and we can discuss those issues. Let us make it very interactive, otherwise मजा नहीं आएगा क्योंकि अपने लोग प्रैक्टिकली काम कर रहे हैं तो जितना अपने डिस्कस करेंगे उतना अच्छा रहेगा. How do we arrive at the creditor debtors are MSME or not? No confirmation could be received from them. So generally अपने एक नोट देते हैं कि सामने वाला अगर कम्युनिकेट कर रहा है MSME का, then we disclose them as MSME. अगर सामने वाला कोई कंफर्म नहीं कर रहा है, then we do not disclose them as MSME and we put that as part of the notes to financial statements. Also जब ऑफिस मेमोरेंडम एक आया था MSME के ऊपर, तो जनरली स्पीकिंग बिल के ऊपर we should mention that we are an MSME. अगर बिल के ऊपर MSME mentioned है, तो we should identify those parties as MSME mandatorily and disclose that as part of the financial statements. अगर बिल के ऊपर mention नहीं है, there should be an internal control or process within the organization to write to those particular creditors whether they are MSME or not. If no one confirms positively, then we assume that they are not MSME. There should be a practice within the organization and internal control to identify vendors as MSME or not. Whether NBFCs are required to disclose loans and advances. In the Schedule 3, whatever disclosures are relevant would be applicable for all companies. So Division 1 अगर applicable है, तो सभी companies में applicable है. So we do not have an exception with respect to an NBFC and non-NBFC. Meaning of total income would be as disclosed in the financial statements, which would include turnover of the company plus other income. as per division 1. So all the disclosures, yes, would be applicable to small companies as well. So even a small company would have to comply with all the Schedule 3 disclosure requirements, because Schedule 3 is part of the statute and it does not distinguish between small and non-small companies. Any other question on Schedule 3 disclosures? We can move ahead to Caro 2020 then. So I think we can skip on applicability. So applicability, essentially small companies are not covered. So there could be a private limited company which has a borrowing of more than 1 crore, but it is a small company under the Companies Act. So if a company is a small company, Caro 2020 would not be applicable to that particular company. Just be mindful of the fact a small company cannot be a holding or a subsidiary company. If that particular company is either a holding company or a subsidiary company, that company does not meet the definition of a small company under section 2/85 of the Companies Act. So just remember this particular clause. I think we miss out on this particular clause. We just check the paid up capital and the total turnover of the company. We sometimes ignore or forget to evaluate the test whether a particular company is a small is a holding or a subsidiary. If a particular company is a holding or a subsidiary, that company can never be considered as a small company. Otherwise, generally speaking, a Caro 2020 will not be applicable to a private company which has a paid up capital reserves of not more than 1 crore, total borrowings of not more than 1 crore, and total revenue of not more than 10 crores. So we have to ensure that all the three conditions are cumulatively satisfied for a private limited company for Caro 2020 not to be applicable. So just for the purpose of clarification, the order would be applicable to, we do not have unlimited companies, but the order would be applicable to all private unlimited companies. Also, for the purpose of computation of paid up share capital, bonus shares have to be considered. Whatever is the paid up capital that is disclosed as part of your financial statement should be considered for the purpose of computation of paid up capital limit. Share application receipt or pending allotment will not be considered for the purpose. Whether all the ratios applicable to Nbfc also. So if it is part of division 1, yes, the disclosures would be applicable, but only the relevant disclosures would need to be given, and we may refer to other disclosures as not applicable. So depending on the particular company, depending on the particular business, there could be certain disclosures which are not applicable considering the activity of the company, so which we need to evaluate. Where a company enjoys a cash credit facility whose balance is fluctuating in nature, the order would apply if the outstanding exceeds 1 crore on any day during the financial year. So the limit is very, very small. So if you have a 1 crore outstanding of more than 1 crore, the CC would be considered as a borrowing, and therefore Caro would be applicable. Just a broad snapshot of the summary of the changes. There are certain clauses which are modified. Modified clauses would include clauses relating to fixed assets, inventories, repayment of loan granted by the company, whether there is a default in repayment of dues, reporting of frauds with respect to needy company, and with respect to registration with RBI. So these are the clauses which have been modified. New clauses which have been introduced are in respect of income tax search and seizure, whether there is a transaction not recorded in the books. We have to comment on whether the company will be able to meet its liabilities, considering the ratios which are disclosed, considering the ratios such as solvency ratios, etc., which we have to compute internally to evaluate whether the company would be able to meet its liabilities within the next 12 months. Requirement with respect to disclosure of CSR, whether there is an obligation in respect of CSR and the necessary amount has been transferred to the relevant fund. If there has been a resignation during the year, resignation could be at the time of AGM also. The only criteria is that term should not have been expired and the auditor has resigned before the term completes. So an auditor generally is appointed for a period of 5 years under the Companies Act. If an auditor is resigning before the completion of 5 years, irrespective of whether the particular auditor has retired at an AGM concern or has resigned at a particular AGM concern in between, we have to disclose whether the auditor has resigned before the appointed term, and are there any issues which are required to be dealt with as part of the resignation. We have to disclose in the consolidated financial statements audit report also reference to negative remarks in subsidiary and associates. Caro. Internal audit, whether appropriate or not, whether adequate or not, and whether you have considered the issues which have been raised as part of the internal audit in drawing up the financial statements is also a reporting requirement now. Cash loss, whether the company has incurred a cash loss, is again required to be reported. There are certain clauses which are retained and continue and disclosure requirements with respect there to continue to remain. One clause which has been deleted is in respect of managerial remuneration. That disclosure on managerial remuneration now forms part of the main reporting requirement under section 143 and therefore has not been reproduced as part of the Caro. Any questions or concerns here? So, what I'll do is, considering the time involved, time, and we will discuss only the issues which are there in respect of specific clauses. We will not get into each clause. Certain clauses which are repeated, I know those clauses because we are already aware of what the disclosure requirements are, and we will go ahead with certain specific issues which are. With respect to property, plant, and equipment, broadly speaking, the disclosure requirements are same. There are 3 or 4 points here which are very, very relevant. There is now a disclosure requirement with respect to intangible assets. So whenever we are disclosing intangible assets as part of your financial statements, we need to ensure that the company is maintaining proper records in showing full particulars of intangible assets. There could be scenarios where the company has certain intangibles but are not recorded in the books of accounts because the recognition criteria is not met. It is suggested that the company also maintains a record of those intangible assets such as trademarks, internally generated brands. Those records should be available with the company, and there should be a register which should be maintained with respect to the disclosure requirement with respect to intangible assets are similar to the reporting requirement with respect to property, plant, and equipment. A disclosure requirement which is there in respect of immovable properties. This has been slightly modified. We have to disclose the details of title deeds of all immovable properties which are not in the name of the company. So this disclosure requirement, we have to specifically state now in whose name the particular immovable properties is held in. This and the gross carrying value of the particular immovable property. Now, the entity in whose name the immovable property is registered in, whether that particular entity or the person is a promoter, director, or relative or employee. So a particular disclosure needs to be made if the title deed is in the name of, not in the name of the particular company concerned, but is in the name of promoter, director, or relative. And the period since which the particular immovable property is held is also needs to be disclosed. We also need to disclose why the property is not held in the name of the company. Why was the property registered in the name of someone else? There could be a scenario where a company A has merged with company B, in which case the property continues to be registered in the name of company A. Necessary rectification or necessary registry needs to be carried out in the register of assurance. And if that has not been done, we again need to disclose the fact and the necessary procedure formalities need to be completed and ensure that the company is now, that the property is now registered in the name of the amalgamated company. So this is again a disclosure requirement as part of the Schedule 3, and we need to reproduce those disclosures as part of the Caro 2020 as well. A question Snigdha ji ka hai ki the property was purchased in 1999 but not registered in the name of the company. So only sale agreement done, what will be the disclosure? So the first question which arises here is whether this would be forming part of property, plant and equipment, or would be forming part of advance or a capital advance. That is a question because we are not in control of the particular asset concerned. If under the Transfer of Property Act, we have a control over the asset concerned and we are disclosing that as an asset, there could be a dispute because of which the particular property is not registered in our name, and the necessary litigation or the dispute which is there because of which the sale agreement has not been registered in our name should be duly disclosed as part of the reason for not being held in the name of the company. So first of all, we need to ensure that the asset recognition criteria is duly met with respect to the sale agreement. If the asset recognition criteria is met, it could be met for under the Transfer of Property Act. We need to ensure that the nature of dispute, if any, is appropriately disclosed as part of clause 3(1)(c) of Caro. There is a requirement to disclose revaluations, if any, with respect to the property, plant and equipment. If the movement in revaluation has been more than 10% in respect of each class of PP or intangible asset, there is a less likelihood of more than 90-95% of the companies would probably follow the cost model, and this clause of revaluation would not be applicable. Wherever revaluation is done or a revaluation model is adopted by the company for a particular class of assets under the property, plant and equipment, we need to ensure that any change in the fair value of the particular asset, if it is more than the 10% in respect of each class, is brought out in the disclosure under the Caro as part of 3(1)(d) disclosure. Another reporting requirement which has been introduced is whether the company is holding any beneficiary property. So this again is a significant disclosure requirement, and we have to ensure that if necessary disclosure is there is part of the Schedule 3 requirements as well, and the necessary reference is drawn to the particular note in the financial statements wherever a proceeding has been initiated against the company for holding any beneficiary property, Benami property under the Benami Transactions Act. So the reporting would include the nature of property, the carrying value of the property, what is the status of the proceedings, and consequential impact if the proceedings are decided against the company. Disclosure also needs to be made where a proceeding is initiated post the balance sheet date, because the proceeding is related to a property which is existing as of the balance sheet date. If the proceeding relates to a property which is acquired by a company post the balance sheet date, the disclosure would not be applicable under the subsequent procedures. But where a proceeding is initiated with respect to a property existing as on 31st March, we would have to ensure that in the status of such proceedings as well between the date of signing of the financial statements and the balance sheet date as well. So this is the broad disclosure requirement with respect to property, plant and equipment. Any issue or the concern with respect to PP, we can discuss those and then we can move ahead with the next clause. Coming to inventories, I think again this there has been a significant additional reporting responsibility when it comes to clause 3(2). There are two reporting requirements here, wherein first is whether a physical verification is conducted, and the question is which is required to be answered is if on such physical verification discrepancy between book stock and physical stock is more than 10% for each class. Now, what is the interpretation of each class? That each class would mean maybe how the company looks at a particular class of inventory. Marrying it with accounting standard 2, class would mean raw materials, work in progress, intermediate, packing materials, finished goods. That would be the class of relevant classes of inventories. The company could have a more granular class so as to say that raw materials for a particular site be considered as one class, and wherever the company considers that class, we consider the discrepancy of 10% with respect to that class which the company considers as a class. So the definition of class here is also very relevant, and interpretation thereof needs to be evaluated by the auditor concerned. Especially where the company has two business segments, class should ideally be considered for each business segment separately and not in totality. Ashok ji ka question is, what will we do if we purchase one property and in some case under PMLI is filed against the seller? नहीं, बेनामी प्रॉपर्टी है या नहीं है, मतलब अशोक जी थोड़ा सा क्लैरिफाई करेंगे क्वेश्चन आपका अनम्यूट करके. एक बार अपना हैंड रेज करिए तो आई जस्ट अनम्यूट यू.
एक्चुअली हमने जो प्रॉपर्टी परचेज की है ना,
हाँ,
वो पीएमएलआई में उनके अगेंस्ट में प्रोसीडिंग चालू हुई है.
हाँ,
और पीएमएलआई ने हमको भी एक चिट्ठी लिखी है कि इस प्रॉपर्टी के अगेंस्ट में पीएमएलआई एक्ट का नोटिस इशू किया गया है सेलर को. तो और इसके अलावा और कोई प्रोसीडिंग नहीं हुई है.
नहीं, खाली नोटिस इशू होने से तो नहीं होगा, प्रोसीडिंग्स होना चाहिए.
नहीं, कैसे पता चले कि उसके अगेंस्ट प्रोसीडिंग हुई है कि नहीं है? क्योंकि
नहीं, अगर प्रॉपर्टी अगर आपके हाथ में है, इफ यू आर द बेनामदार, तब तो प्रोसीडिंग्स आपके अगेंस्ट में इशू होगा ना.
हम लोग के अगेंस्ट में कोई प्रोसीडिंग नहीं इशू हुई है, लेकिन जो सेलर है उसके अगेंस्ट में प्रोसीडिंग चालू हुई है.
नहीं, यहाँ पे क्वेश्चन है कि प्रोसीडिंग अगेंस्ट द कंपनी शुड बी इनिशिएटेड. यहाँ पे the question is whether the proceeding against the company has been initiated for holding any benami property.
In that case, इसको अपने को इग्नोर कर सकते हैं या we should qualify the
नहीं, देखिए financial statements में तो disclose करना ही चाहिए, because there is a question mark on whether the property will remain with the company or not. Now you may consider this as that the proceeding has not been initiated against the company. Because you have not been asked to appear, you have not been asked to represent before the income tax authorities. You have just been issued a notice कि ये proceedings चल रहा है. तो आपके अगेंस्ट में तो proceedings initiate हुआ ही नहीं अभी तक.
Yes.
But of course, the fact that this litigation is there, if the property is material to the particular company concerned, then question mark तो property के ऊपर आ ही सकता है ना.
It's clarified. Thank you.
हाँ. The second, in respect of inventories, the second question is probably giving us a lot of sleepless nights with respect to whether with respect to disclosure of financial information to banks and financial institutions. So if we have been sanctioned working capital limits, so the question is, if we have been sanctioned working capital limits, irrespective whether we are utilizing the working capital limits or not, if we are merely sanctioned working capital limits in excess of 5 crores, and that working capital which has been sanctioned is on the basis of security of current assets of the company, whether the quarterly returns or statements filed by the company with such banks or financial institutions are in agreement with the books of accounts of the company. So what we are required to disclose is whether such returns or statements filed with banks are agreeing with the books of accounts of the company that the company we are reviewing or auditing. This comparison becomes very onerous on us, because the trial balance needs to be looked at, because the financials of the company for that quarter needs to be looked at. We need to understand what is being submitted to the banks concerned. We need to ensure the authenticity of the information which the company provides, that this information has been submitted to the bank. These questions, first of all, we have to, once the authenticity is verified of the information which has been submitted to the banks and financial institutions, We need to compare that information with the books of accounts of the company, and if there is discrepancies, the reasons should be documented and put as part of the disclosures. This disclosure should form part of your Schedule 3 disclosures as well as your Caro 2020 disclosure. So what are the disclosure requirements which is there? The name of the bank, the aggregate working capital sanction, what is the current asset disclosed as security, what is the amount disclosed in the return, and what is the amount disclosed amount as per the books of accounts. What is the difference and what is the reason for difference? So this reason for discrepancies should be documented and should be disclosed as part of your audit report as well as your Schedule 3. ये बहुत जरूरी है कि शेड्यूल 3 में डिस्क्लोजर होना जरूरी है, बिकॉज आज आप शेड्यूल 3 में नहीं करोगे तो आपके ऊपर क्वेश्चन आ सकता है कि आपने गलत लिखा। शेड्यूल 3 आप हमेशा ध्यान रखो कि मैनेजमेंट का डिस्क्लोजर है। अगर शेड्यूल 3 में मैनेजमेंट ने लिख रहा है कोई चीज, मैनेजमेंट ने लिखा है कोई चीज, आपने ऑडिट रिपोर्ट में उसको रिपीट किया डिस्क्लोजर, तो यू आर बेसिकली एंडोर्सिंग द व्यू ऑफ द मैनेजमेंट। इफ यू आर नॉट एग्रीइंग टू द व्यू ऑफ द मैनेजमेंट, यू कैन ऑफ कोर्स क्वालिफाई योर रिपोर्ट, but it is very, very important that the Schedule 3 disclosures are appropriately made by the management and they should agree to the disclosure. It is necessary that if there is an incorrect disclosure in the incorrect information being supplied to the financial statements, the reasons for difference should appropriately document that. Now, what could be the reasons? What we could write? There could be incorrect amount of creditors which may be reported. There could be short reporting of a particular creditor. There could be excess debtors which have been disclosed. There could be certain bills which have certain goods which have been supplied, and the same has not been considered as revenue as per the accounting standard 9, but you may have considered that as part of your debtors. Inventories, market price may have been considered instead of cost. There could be n number of reasons why discrepancies could arise. Those reasons should be documented as part of your reasons for discrepancy, if any. In case the statement for quarter ended March is not filed and you're signing the statements in the month of April, you may have to document the fact, report the fact that the company is yet to submit the return or statement for the quarter ended March 2022 with the banks. These disclosures are to be given and the reasons for discrepancy should be given as part of your Caro 2020 as well as Schedule 3. Any questions on this? I think this is again very, very case specific, and you need to look at each particular company to understand why the reason for discrepancy is there. And thankfully, it is quarterly statement, quarterly returns which we need to look at. Any questions here?
विवेक भैया, इसमें क्वेश्चन है
हाँ,
कि क्वार्टरली स्टेटमेंट तो इन लोग बता रहे हैं, बट सम टाइम क्लाइंट बोलते हैं कि हम लोग 28 जून को ही फाइल कर दिए, 28 सितंबर को ही बैंक में फाइल कर दिए, बट अपने जब क्वार्टरली करेंगे तो 30 सितंबर 30 जून ये डेट आता है, तो वहां 3-4 दिन का डिस्क्रिपेंसी रह जाता है. इन दैट केस हाउ टू हैंडल दिस सिचुएशन?
नहीं, इन दैट केस मतलब आप 28 जून का डेट का लीजिए आप बुक्स ऑफ अकाउंट्स, जब आप 30 जून का ले सकते हैं तो 28 जून का भी ले सकते हैं. यहाँ तो क्वार्टरली बोल रहा है, यहाँ पे आपका ये तो बोल नहीं रहा है कि आपका क्वार्टरली मतलब 30 जून ही होना चाहिए.
एग्जैक्टली.
देखिए डिस्क्लोजर तो प्रॉब्लम है, बिकॉज देखिए बुक्स ऑफ अकाउंट्स कई बार अपडेटेड नहीं रहते हैं प्राइवेट लिमिटेड कंपनीज में. छोटे कंपनीज 5 करोड़ का लिमिट तो बहुत ही छोटा है देखा जाए तो. ये प्रॉब्लम तो देखिए डिस्क्लोजर्स कैसे क्या करना है ये चैलेंज तो रहेगा. कहीं पे एक ये व्यू आया था कि अपने ये बोलते हैं कि भाई the private list companies or private unlisted companies, they are not required to disclose any quarterly information anywhere. Books of accounts, what do we compare with as auditors? मतलब Schedule 3 का reporting requirement तो मैनेजमेंट का है, वो करना है मैनेजमेंट को. आज आपने क्या रिपोर्टिंग रिक्वायरमेंट करे कि हम लोग कैसे वेरीफाई करें? क्वेश्चन तो है भाई Schedule 3 का डिस्क्लोजर तो मैनेजमेंट कर दिया, आपने कैसे वेरीफाई करे वो एक क्वेश्चन मार्क है. आपने ये लिखे कि नेसेसरी एविडेंस इज नॉट देयर विद द कंपनी.
अपने को भैया, अपने को तो आई थिंक सो जितना भी स्टेटमेंट बैंक से कलेक्ट करना ही बेटर रहेगा रेदर देन कि अपने पार्टी से रिसीव करें, क्योंकि मैं भी
कंफर्मेशन हो सकता है अपने को बैंक से, मतलब दे विल नेवर शेयर द स्टेटमेंट विद अस. मतलब दे विल, व्हाट वी कैन ऑफ कोर्स डू इज वी कैन राइट to the bank, look, this is what we have been given to understand, that this is the financial information submitted to you for the quarter ended so and so, for the quarter ended so and so, kindly confirm.
Yes.
That we can do. If the bank does not write back to us even after follow-up of 1 or 2 emails, we can very well assume that that is the correct statement. बट अपने को डायरेक्टली लिखना चाहिए.
Exactly.
और उसमें जब भी अपने लिखे तो एक अथॉरिटी लेटर होना चाहिए कि यस फ्रॉम द मैनेजमेंट कंसर्न, दे कैन शेयर द रेलेवेंट इंफॉर्मेशन विद द ऑडिटर कंसर्न. अगर अपने डायरेक्टली लिखेंगे तो वो उनको क्या पता कि हम लोग ऑडिटर हैं नहीं है, हम लोग मांग सकते हैं नहीं मांग सकते इंफॉर्मेशन. तो ऑथराइज सिग्नेटरी का एक वो होना चाहिए.
Yes, right.
Even as part of the audit procedure, now what we also need to ensure that each bank account which the company has, we need to ensure that हर एक का authorized signatory का डिटेल अपने पास अवेलेबल है. वो बहुत जरूरी है. आज जो लेजर में नाम मेंटेन हो रहा है कंपनी का, बैंक अकाउंट का, उस बैंक के साथ अकाउंट नंबर भी मेंशन रहे. क्या होता है कि आज सपोज करिए एचडीएफसी बैंक में 4 अकाउंट है, अपने कहां तक आइडेंटिफाई करते रहेंगे कौन सा बैंक में कौन सा अकाउंट है.
Right.
तो ये सब चीज अब प्रोसेस में क्या ना कि लाना पड़ेगा. अब वो टाइम रहा नहीं कि भाई ट्रांसपेरेंसी नहीं रखे. अब क्या पता फ्यूचर में अपने को लेजर ही अपलोड करना पड़े. आजकल तो डेटा का कोई रेस्ट्रिक्शन नहीं है. With the blockchain and artificial intelligence coming in, you never know the kind of information that the company may ask, and that the regulators may ask in future. Even if you look at the next year, the software का requirement जो है कि भी आपको डेली का ट्रेल रहना चाहिए कि अगर कोई अकाउंट एंट्री आप डिलीट करें उसका भी ट्रेल रहना चाहिए. So these things will create, एक तो भी अपॉर्चुनिटीज तो आएंगे बट रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटीज बहुत बढ़ के आएंगे हर एक चीज का.
भैया इससे रिलेटेड एक और चेंज कहीं कारो में एक आया है कि वेदर कंपनी है डिफॉल्टेड बाय इन द पेमेंट ईएमआई, तो वी शुड टेक एंड रिप्रेजेंट फ्रॉम द मैनेजमेंट एज वेल एज द बैंक. तो बैंक भी इस केस में कितने दे पाएगी नहीं दे पाएगी, हाउ टू हैंडल दिस सिचुएशन?
No, again we should again write to the bank for a direct confirmation. देखिए यहाँ पे क्या होता है ना, अपने ऑडिट का टेस्ट और मतलब जो ऑडिटर का जो स्मेल बोलते हैं ना अपने की भी गट फीलिंग, दैट इज वेरी वेरी रेलेवेंट. वी हैव टू गो बियॉन्ड द फिगर्स. आज अपने अगर देख रहे हैं कि भी कंपनी का बिजनेस ठीक चल रहा है, कंपनी कंप्लायंट है, टीडीएस रिटर्न्स टाइमली दे रहा है, जीएसटी रिटर्न्स टाइमली जमा कर रहा है, आरओसी फाइलिंग्स टाइमली कर रहा है. So these compliances etc. ensure that the company is broadly compliant. We can understand that. We can look at the company, we can understand how the company is, whether the interest is being paid on time, whether the term loans are being repaid on time, EMIs timely pay हो रहा है या नहीं हो रहा है. We can look at those aspects and understand whether the company is broadly compliant. उस केस में चांसेस होना कि भी कंपनी डिफॉल्ट करेगा वेरी रिमोट. उस केस में सपोज करिए कंफर्मेशन नहीं भी आया तो कोई बात नहीं, बट जहां पे आप देख रहे हो कि देयर इज रेगुलरली अ डिले इन पेमेंट, कंपनी जीएसटी लेट से पे कर रहा है या टीडीएस लेट कर रहा है या कोई भी पीएफ ईएसआई वगैरह भी टाइम से नहीं कर रहा है, इन दैट केस वी नीड टू वेरी मच इंश्योर दैट दोस direct confirmations are positively obtained, because our audit risk increases significantly in those scenarios. मतलब एक पर्टिकुलर सिनेरियो में बता रहे हैं जहाँ पे there was मतलब we were not sure of whether there was a default or not. मैनेजमेंट बोल रहा था कि सारा चीज सही है. So in that case, when we obtained a positive confirmation from the lender concerned, we identified there was a difference between the books of accounts and the confirmation which we received from the particular financial institution. And that financial institution was not a bank. So क्या होता है कि NBFCs वगैरह भी financial institution के definition में covered है. So we have to be very very careful with how we make these disclosures as part of the auditor's report.
This is actually first year, तो शायद चैलेंज रहेगा. We have to work out all the things and next year से फिर लगता है used to हो जाएंगे. I think so.
नहीं वो तो यूज टू हो जाएंगे. प्रॉब्लम क्या होता है ना सर, आज अपने लोग के लिए पहला साल है. रेगुलेटर्स 3 साल बाद देखते हैं कोई भी अकाउंट को, चाहे इनकम टैक्स हो चाहे वो कंपनीज एक्ट हो.
राइट.
हाँ वो उस समय तक वो बोलते हैं कि आप पहला साल ऑडिट तो आप ही किए ना. आजकल तो ऑडिटर को भी समन कर लेते हैं.
एग्जैक्टली.
हाँ मतलब हर जगह पे मतलब कुछ भी प्रॉब्लम है तो ऑडिटर इज द फर्स्ट पर्सन हु इज रिस्पांसिबल. मतलब आपको बताते कल हम एक क्लाइंट के साथ मीटिंग कर रहे थे, जस्ट एक रिव्यू कर रहे थे ऑडिट का. तो हम ऐसे ही बोले कि भी फाइनेंशियल स्टेटमेंट्स तो आप भी बनाओगे ना. तो बोले कि वो तो ऑडिटर ही बनाता है, हम लोग का रिस्पांसिबिलिटी थोड़ी ना है. well, that is a mindset. मतलब आप बोलोगे ना, मतलब किसी से बात करोगे कि भाई आप क्या मतलब अपना काम है, मतलब वो बोलेगा कि मेरा तो काम ही नहीं है अकाउंटिंग स्टैंडर्ड। एंड अपना अब जो टाइम आ गया ना कंप्लायंस का या डिस्क्लोजर्स का, इट इज बेटर दैट द क्लाइंट ड्रॉज अप द फाइनेंशियल्स,
राइट,
इट इज बेटर, मच बेटर। यू मे हैंड होल्ड हिम फॉर द फर्स्ट ईयर, दैट आप अपना स्ट्रक्चर रेडी कर लो, टेम्पलेट रेडी कर दो, सब कुछ कर दो, बट यू नीड टू इंश्योर दैट द मैनेजमेंट ड्रॉज अप द फाइनेंशियल्स, बिकॉज आप उसमें जो चेंजेस करना है, नोट्स बनाना है, वो बनाओ, बट फर्स्ट ड्राफ्ट जो है वो मैनेजमेंट से आने से आपके ऊपर बड़ा कंफर्ट आएगा, मतलब दैट वुड यू वुड बी एबल टू ऐड मोर वैल्यू इन अदर एरियाज।
एग्जैक्टली।
हाँ, दैट इज वेरी वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट आई थिंक।
थैंक यू भैया, गो अहेड।
थैंक यू। With respect to investments, guarantees, securities, loans, and advances, there has been a significant increase in what the disclosure requirements are now. We look at the clause has been modified, and we look at each individual clause for just to understand whether during the year the company has provided loans or provided advances in the nature of loans. This has been phrase has been very clearly inserted and introduced. Stood guarantee or provided security to any other entity. If so, indicate the aggregate amount during the year and balance outstanding as on the balance sheet date with respect to such loans or guarantees or security to subsidiaries, joint ventures, and associates. So here the definition of subsidiaries, joint venture, and associates has been to be taken as per the Companies Act and not as per the accounting standard. So the aggregate amount and the balance is outstanding with respect to such loans, advances, guarantees, security to as subsidiaries, joint venture, and associates need to be disclosed separately. And the aggregate amount during the year and balance outstanding with respect to such items other than subsidiaries, JVs, and associates. So we have to disclose for subsidiaries, JVs, and associates separately, and then other than subsidiaries, JVs, and associates separately. So this again, the biggest challenge here is, of course, firstly that we have to identify advances in the nature of loans, and the second important point here is the subsidiary, JV, or associate has to be identified as per the definition of Companies Act 13, not as per the definition under the accounting standard. So whatever disclosures that we are making as part of accounting standard or related parties disclosures as per the accounting standard may not reconcile with the disclosure requirements which are here. So this is a very very important point, and we should be aware of this. And if there is again a difference, I think an appropriate note should be put in the financial statements. Next disclosure requirement is with respect to loans and advances in the nature of loans, whether the schedule of repayment of principal and the payment of interest has been stipulated, and if stipulated, whether such receipts or repayments are regular. The amount is overdue, whether any amount is overdue, and if the total amount is overdue for more than 90 days, whether reasonable steps have been taken by the company for recovery of principal and interest. So again, here the requirement is we have to know that we have to, most of the cases, what we do is, what the clients do or what the companies do is they show loans and advances without any stipulation of repayment. So here we have to understand that firstly here, what are the loans and advances where the amount of whether repayment is stipulated, whether repayment and payment is stipulated, and based on such stipulation, whether such repayments or receipts are regular, whether such repayment timeline or the payment of interest is not stipulated. We will come to the next clause wherein we are required to disclose how much of such loans are not, the terms of which are not stipulated or terms of repayment are not stipulated. We have to disclose that separately. Again, the clause E specifically talks about evergreening of loans. So if there are certain companies wherein, if you look at, for example, Mahindra Holidays, wherein there has been, wherein it has been disclosed that so much of the amount has been renewed during the year. So any amount, any loans which has been renewed during the current year, or fresh loan has been granted to settle the existing loans, we have to specifically state that. What can happen here is, for example, if we are disclosing certain loans as short-term loans in the last year, the short-term loans would mean essentially that the loans will be repayable within a period of 12 months. If the loan is not repaid within a period of 12 months by 31st March 2022, and then again the said loan is classified as short-term loans repayable on demand, this would indicate that the loan has been renewed during the year. In that case, we are required to disclose the fact that the particular loan has been renewed during the year, and therefore the aggregate amount of such loans which have been renewed to the percentage of total loans granted during the year, it needs to be disclosed as part of your financial statements. This disclosure requirement is also there in the Schedule 3 requirement as well, and therefore we may probably refer to the disclosure requirement of the Schedule 3 as well here. If a company has granted loans or advances either repayable on demand or without specifying any terms or period of repayment, what is the aggregate amount and the percentage thereof to the total loans granted, aggregate amount of loans granted to the promoters, related parties as defined in section 276 of the Companies Act 13. Now, there are two disclosures here. One is, of course, what is the total amount of loans which have been granted to promoters or related parties which are repayable on demand, and what is which are repayable on demand or without specifying any terms of repayment or period of repayment, and to other parties. So wherever such loans have been granted to related parties under section 276 of the Companies Act 13, and such loans are repayable on demand, such disclosure needs to be disclosed, and we need to compare that with the total loans granted during the year. Again, it may not be necessary that money has actually gone out for the purpose of granting the loans. There could be a renewal of loan during the year for the purpose of which this disclosure requirements under clause 3 becomes applicable. So even if a loan is renewed during the year, it will be considered as a loan granted during the year. So this point needs to be kept in mind, because the way the language of the Caro is worded, it implies that loan renewal is also a loan granted. So we need to be mindful of the fact, and again very careful when disclosure of this clause is made. We need to prepare a summary of all the loans which have been given to any entity during the year. We have to identify whether the particular entity is a subsidiary, JV, associate, related party, promoter, key managerial personnel, and then disclose. And then we have to have specific columns with respect to opening, loans renewed, loans given, loans repaid, interest जो अपने एक बनाते हैं टेबुलर फॉर्म में इनकम टैक्स असेसमेंट्स वगैरह करने में, या जो भी डिस्प्ले के टाइम पे वो डिस्क्लोजर्स अपने पास रेडिली अवेलेबल होना चाहिए फॉर द पर्पस ऑफ रिपोर्टिंग अंडर दिस क्लास. We need to be very, very careful and ensure that the disclosure requirements are properly done to ensure compliance with the reporting requirement under Caro 20. मतलब इनफैक्ट आप अगर टाटा स्टील का एक डिस्क्लोजर देखोगे, वहां पे ये लिखा हुआ है एक जगह पे, the amounts were due for repayment in earlier years but have not been collected as on 31st March 2022. So even जहाँ पे मतलब there has been significant disclosures which have been put by the auditors in various annual reports. Clause 3 by इसमें कोई concerns issues 3 में I think देखिए वो practically करने में again this is a very fact case specific scenario, and therefore we need to look at how the disclosures are made. Three, 4 अपने ignore करेंगे, 185, 186 the compliance was always there. Public deposits and deemed deposits, again, the requirement is slightly modified, but broadly speaking, the reporting requirements are same as the Caro 2016. Cost records, again, the reporting requirement is same. loan from HUF is considered as a deposit or not? Sir, अगर shareholder है private limited company है, then it falls under the category of deposit, but the company private limited company होने से the company is entitled to take such deposits. However, अगर shareholder नहीं है, तो challenge तो है. Just because a Karta is a director, this does not mean that HUF से आप loan ले सकते. HUF may be treated as a separate entity. Again, deposits के definition में private limited company में relative from director is exempt, so that can also be considered if it is an exempted deposit. हाँ राजेश भैया. Cost records same ही था जो last year Caro 2016 में था. Undisputed dues. The only thing here is the dues have been slightly widened. Therefore, the clause does not restrict itself to specific statutory dues. The clause is wide enough to cover all undisputed statutory dues, including. So, therefore, the clause which has been now introduced, there has been a wide definition of statutory dues. So, any statutory due which is not paid because is now required to be reported under clause 7. This again is an onerous task upon us as auditors. What we are required to report here is any transaction which is not recorded in the books of accounts have been surrendered or disclosed as income during the year in the tax assessments under the Act 1961. If so, whether the previously unrecorded income has been properly recorded in the books of accounts during the year. So this disclosure requirement is again, we need to look at how during a search or a survey, the particular assessee has disclosed in the statement if any particular income has been disclosed by the assessee concerned in the course of search or survey assessments. The nature of income, how the said income has been brought into in the books of accounts, that aspect needs to be considered, and appropriate accounting entry needs to be disclosed. This needs to be made in the books of accounts. Also, we need to look at the perspective of whether there is a possibility of fraud on or by the company. That aspect may also need to be evaluated when we report on this particular clause. Because an item, if we say that a particular income, unrecorded income has escaped or not accounted for in the books of accounts, a question may come in with respect to the internal control over financial reporting as to why this particular item was not disclosed. So whenever there is a search or a survey, we need to look at how the particular item or that has been disclosed as part of the income tax is accounted for or appropriately disclosed in the books of accounts. This again, there should be appropriate guidance which should be issued by the institute on this aspect, ideally speaking, because there are a lot of complexities when it comes to disclosures here. We need to look at various aspects as we discussed with respect to internal control over financial reporting, fraud reporting, which are offshoots of any transaction which are not recorded as a result of surrendering or disclosure of income during the tax assessments. There's a possibility to argue that where a particular income has been offered to just 5 piece and without any and against which we are litigating, such amounts may not be treated as surrendering or disclosure of income under the tax assessments. So we need to look at that aspect as well. This is broadly with respect to 3/8. With respect to 3/9, clause has been significantly modified with respect to disclosure of defaults. This is what Rajesh was discussing about. And if we look at the disclosure requirements here, we have to disclose lender-wise details now of the wherever there is a default. A lender-wise default would include banks, financial institutions, and government. Amount not paid on due date. What is the amount not paid, whether it is a principal or the interest, what is the number of days which has been delayed, and what are any remarks, if any. So default would include non-payment of dues to lenders as on the last date specified in the loan documents. So all the defaults to lenders should be disclosed as part of the disclosure requirements under clause 3/9. And we need to disclose defaults on repayment of loans, borrowings to any lender, irrespective whether the lender is a bank, financial institution, or government only. All nature of delays should be reported. Lender-wise details, however, should only be reported with respect to banks, financial institutions, and government. This again would involve a lot of work in terms of the due date of payment, the date of payment. All those details should be compiled and prepared by the auditor concerned to ensure that appropriate disclosure is made under the Caro 2020. This again, whether the company is a declared willful defaulter by any bank or financial institutions or other lender. Here the requirement is only with respect to the company concerned, not with respect to the directors. So if a company has been regularly paying the loans, repaying the loans as per the agreed sanction terms, there's no question of a default here. We, of course, wherever there is regularity of default or the company is falling in SMA category regularly, we need to ensure that we write to the bank to ask whether the company has been declared as a willful defaulters. Particularly where the loan account has been declared as an NPA, there we need to ensure that a direct confirmation from the bank is positively obtained. Such direct confirmations would help as part of the audit procedures to report under this particular clause. Term loans, whether they were applied for the purpose for which they were obtained, if not, the amount of loan so diverted and the purpose for which it is used will be reported. The language used is very, very harsh in terms of if the loans are not applied for the purpose, what is the amount diverted and the purpose for which will be reported. There could be a scenario wherein the loan is not used but is lying as fixed deposit as at the close of the year. If that is the case, the same should also be reported that the same is pending utilization. We need to be very, very mindful and ensure that the loan is actually utilized for the purpose of the end user is actually utilized. There are scenarios where the bank provides a certificate from a different chartered accountant with respect to the end use of the funds or the loans taken. We need to ensure the veracity and the authenticity of that certificate to ensure and the basis on which the management has prepared the certificate. Whether the management that the certificate that the management has prepared is reconciling with the financial statements or the books of accounts is also something which the auditor needs to evaluate when reporting under this clause. Funds raised on short term have been utilized for long term purposes. If yes, the nature and amount. Funds have the first requirement is we are raising funds on short-term basis. For example, if we are taking cash credit or a short-term loan, and if we are utilizing those funds for the purpose of acquisition of an asset or an immovable property, such disclosure would mean that such use of short-term funds would mean that we are utilizing the funds for long-term purposes, which is not appropriate. So if that is the case, what is the amount which has been raised on short-term basis, and what is the amount that has been utilized for long-term purposes, and what is the nature of utilization, and the amount has to be indicated as part of your Caro 2020 reporting requirement here. You would require to review the balance sheet and the cash flow statement to understand how the funds movement has happened. So whenever the funds have been drawn from the cash credit account or the funds have been taken as short-term loan, we need to look at whether the short-term funds have been deployed for the purpose of long-term. The one thing to ensure is the clause 3(9)(c) reporting requirement is term loans. We have to report whether term loans have been utilized for the purpose for which they were obtained. Since term loans are normally long-term in nature, we are not reporting on short-term loans in 3(9)(c) here. In 3(9)(d) clause, however, we are required to report whether the funds raised on short term have been utilized for long term. The nature and the amount needs to be indicated here. So 3C subpara C talks about term loans, which are essentially long term in nature generally, and D talks about funds raised on short term basis. This again a clause which has been introduced, where if a company has taken any funds from any entity or person to meet the obligations of subsidiaries, associates, or joint ventures, what are the details thereof, and the nature and transactions and the amount of each case needs to be disclosed as part of this clause. So if a company does not have a subsidiary, associate, or joint venture, of course, this clause is not applicable. If subsidiary, associate, or joint venture exists, we need to understand whether the parent company has funded the obligations taken by subsidiary, associate, or joint venture. And if that is the case, what has that been taken from borrowed funds? If the borrowed funds have been availed, the disclosure has to be made as part of your financials, as part of your Caro 2020. Whether the company has raised during the year loan on the pledge of securities held in subsidiaries, joint ventures, associate companies, details thereof should be disclosed. So wherever we are pledging the shares of subsidiaries and joint ventures and associates, even as part of the raising of loan during the year, we need to report that fact. And if we also need to report the fact if there is a default in the repayment of such loan. The default may imply that the subsidiary, joint venture, associates may come into trouble later and therefore impair the asset which the company has in the subsidiary, JV, and associate. This clause 310 was already there with respect to money raised by IPO or FPO, whether they are applied for the purpose for which they are obtained, and subsequent rectification, if any, may be reported. This clause was already there with respect to preferential allotment and private placement of shares. We skip this clause. We need to ensure that the compliance with 42 and 62 is applicable. With respect to fraud, the first clause was always there. The second clause with respect to report under section 143(12) in ADT 4, if that has been filed or not, is required to be disclosed. So wherever there is a fraud exceeding 1 crore, we need to comply with the reporting requirements under ADT 4, the ROC concern, and as auditors, we need to report in ADT 4 of the nature of the fraud under to the Ministry of Corporate Affairs. So this is again. We need to look at wherever there is a fraud in the company by the employees of more than 1 crore, we need to report this fact as part of ADT 4. Again, one more clause which has been introduced is respect to whistleblower complaints. So whatever whistleblower complaints have been received by the company or has been considered by the board committees thereof, we need to look at what are the whistleblower complaints and if how the company has dealt with the whistleblower complaints. We need to appropriately document it in our working papers, the nature of complaint and how you as auditor has dealt with respect to this whistleblower complaint. If the whistleblower complaint is with respect to financial statements, which may affect the true and fair view of the profit or financial statement, you need to look at how you appropriately deal with it in the audit report as well. Skip Nidhi companies, although the clause has been modified, but since there are effectively no insignificant number of Nidhi companies, we may actually skip that. Transaction with related parties are same as what was there as in the earlier. This reporting requirement with respect to internal audit is there, whether the company has an internal audit system commensurate with the size and nature. Also, whether the report of the internal auditors have been considered by the statutory auditor or not. That when we are reporting under this clause. So any adverse observation which the internal auditor has given as part of its report, the statutory auditor needs to consider whether whether the observations have been properly dealt with in the financials. 3/15 would be the same clause which is there with respect to non-cash transaction. 316 is again a significant reporting requirement, whether the company is required to be registered under section 45IA of the Reserve Bank. If so, whether the registration has been obtained. It does not stop at that. This was always there under the Caro 2016 as well. Whether the company is an Nbfc or HFC without a valid COR from the RBI as per RBI Act 1934. Whether the company is a CIC as defined under the regulations made by RBI. If so, whether it continues to fulfill the criteria of a CIC. And the company, in case the company is exempted or unregistered CIC, whether it continues to fulfill such criteria. As per RBI guidelines, if the total assets is less than 100 crores and if you do not have any leveraged funds, you are not required to be registered as a CIC. You are exempted from the registration as a CIC. We need to again evaluate whether the company is fulfilling such criteria to be a CIC. If the group has more than one CICs as part of the group, we are required to indicate the number of CICs which are part of it. All these amendments are as a result of the ILFS fallout, wherein the business was conducted through a large number of subsidiaries JVs, and there was significant number of CICs within the group, and there was a multiplier effect of the leveraging that was done. So essentially, the RBI this requirement has been introduced as part of the RBI suggestion to understand how many CICs are there, whether the company has taken is an Nbfc without obtaining COR. All those disclosures are now forming part of the audit report. We need to be very, very careful with respect to the disclosure requirements, especially if we are treating a particular company as a CIC, which does not require registration. This requirement is therefore very, very relevant. We have to look at the disclosure requirements very, very carefully. Whether the company has incurred cash losses in the financial year and in the immediately preceding year. If so, the amount of cash losses. Again, the working of the cash losses need to be done very carefully. We need to look at loss before tax, add back depreciation, and reduce any liabilities written back or any add back non-cash items which are there. We do not look at cash flow per se, but we look at the cash flow from the under the indirect method by looking at the profit or loss before tax, and then making adjustments for non-cash items to arrive at whether there has been a cash loss. This would be a statement of fact, and we would require to report what is the amount of cash loss in the financial year and in the immediately preceding financial year. 18, we have talked about resignation of statutory auditors, whether the auditor has taken into consideration the issues, objections, or concerns raised by the outgoing auditors. So as part of the ethics, we are required to write to the auditor concerned with respect to whether he has any objection or issues or concern with respect to the audit being taken over. So we need to look at what are the objections or issues or concerns raised by the outgoing auditors, and we need to write to them, and if they do not have any objections or concerns, we accordingly report the fact as part of the reporting requirements here. The auditor resignation is now being looked at very seriously by the Ministry of Corporate Affairs, and unless there is a reasonable reason, it is suggested that the resignations are not, that the auditor is not, that the change in auditor or the resignation is generally looked at adversely and raises a red flag on the company concerned. We need to be very careful when we take up audit assignments as a result of resignation of the previous auditors. 19 talks about financial ratios. We talk about solvency of the company. We need to comment on whether the auditor is of the opinion that material uncertainty exists or not, as on the date of audit report, that the company is capable of meeting its liabilities existing at the balance sheet date as and when they fall due within a period of 1 year from the balance sheet date. So we need to look at the solvency ratios. We need to look at the current ratio, to look at whether the current liabilities which are there or the liabilities which the company has today, whether the company would be able to meet the liabilities as and when they fall due. So the asset liability matching should be done to understand whether that solvency is there for the next 12 months, based on which how you are commenting on the going concern of the particular company concern. 320 talks about in respect of talks about CSR. So whether the company, in respect of other than ongoing projects, the company has transferred the unspent amount to the fund specified in Schedule 7 within a period of 6 months, which would be Prime Minister Relief Fund or specific fund as notified, or any amount which is in respect of the ongoing project has been transferred to a special account. So either of the two needs to be complied with to ensure compliance with clause 3. 21 is with respect to CFS only. So what is required here is this is not applicable to standalone. This is only applicable to consolidated. So what we require to report here, we have to tabulate the qualifications or adverse remarks given by the respective auditors in the companies included in CFS, and we have to disclose the para number wherein the qualification or adverse remark is there. So all the tabulation has to be done and given as part of the CFS audit report as part of Caro 2020. The clause number of such companies containing the qualification, the adverse remark needs to be given. So this is broadly speaking the disclosure requirement which is there as part of Caro 2020. We discussed Schedule 3 requirement. Any questions here? Happy to take. I'm happy to take the questions. I think we may have 3, 4, 5 minutes of questions, and then Ms. Bhatt can take over the session on NBFC.
तुम टेकअप ले लो क्वेश्चन का चैट बॉक्स से.
इस चैट बॉक्स में तो और कोई क्वेश्चन दिखा नहीं. अच्छा,
there is some chat box, but there is some question I think you missed. You will better check it out whether you missed or not.
एक सेकंड,
because some question you have taken.
Work in progress of a builder is to be covered. Yes, work in progress of a builder would be required to be covered, and we need to disclose that as that work in progress of builder would form part of inventories, and therefore inventory disclosure would include work in progress of a builder as well. Ratio of return on investment. So I think there is a very difference in views of various auditors or management with respect to how the return on investment is disclosed. So what we generally do here is we disclose return on investment on quoted investment separately from return on investment on unquoted investment. And the return on investment on quoted investment would be, of course, the change in market price, and also look at the dividend which the company has earned during the year. With respect to unquoted investment, we look at the difference in the retained earnings between 31st March 22 and 31st March 21, and based on how that profit earned during the year upon the net worth of the company in the last year may be treated as a return on investment for unquoted shares. That is how we generally do. Any other view would be welcome, because this would not be applicable if I do not have any investment. That again is clear. If only if I have investments, this particular ratio is applicable. In case of appointment of firm as auditor in a company, whether proprietorship firm is also covered under the category of firm, allowing to sign financial statements. No, the proprietorship firm is not covered. That's 5 years, unless if a rotation is applicable, then 5 years would be the period for which the proprietorship concern can become the auditor of the company. If there is old sundry creditor above 3 years and due to quality dispute payment has not been made, should it be disclosed, written off, or disclosed separately in the financial statements? नहीं, देखिए सर, written off होगा या नहीं, ये तो अभी मैनेजमेंट का व्यू है, और मतलब we have to look at whether as auditors we feel that the said amount will not be payable considering the nature of the dispute. If we are continuing to disclose that as creditor, we of course need to show it as a disputed creditor and under the head trade tables only. So in the aging classification, we need to disclose these creditors as disputed creditors. In case search and seizure additional assets have been disclosed, whether the same would lead to benami transactions. नहीं, search and seizure में अगर additional assets disclose है तो benami transaction नहीं हुआ, undisclosed income हो सकता है. अनडिस्क्लोज इनकम के कारण ही तो एसेट बना ना, मतलब एसेट तो अलग चीज हो गया. एसेट तो डिस्क्लोज जो कर रहे हैं आप, बेसिकली इनकम जो अर्न की हो प्रीवियसली, उसको आप एसेट में कन्वर्ट हो गया, दैट इज बीइंग डिस्क्लोज्ड. सर्च एंड सीजर में आपने इनकम को ही डिस्क्लोज किया ना, सो दैट इनकम नीड्स टू बी लुक्ड एट. एंड बेनामी ट्रांजैक्शंस का तो आपको इवैल्यूएट करना है, प्रोसीडिंग्स हैव बीन इनिशिएटेड एज ऑडिटर्स. So that does not mean that just because additional assets have been disclosed, this would mean that there's a benami property which the company owns. For external confirmation from banks, debtors, creditors, can we ask the management to write to bank for confirming the balance directly to us? Of course, you can do that, but of course, you need to ensure that you are marked as you are copied in the email. it is generally preferred as part of the audit procedure that you write to the bank directly with a copy to the management concern. The challenge here is if the management is directly writing, we are not sure of the email ID to which the management is sending the email to. That is a concern. We have to perform additional procedures to ensure that the email of the concerned person is correct. There could be some spelling mistake. For example, if I'm writing to ICICI Bank, I can write to icicbank.in, which is not a valid domain of icicibank.com. So there could be some concerns which arise if the management is writing directly to the bank or the financial institution concerned. That could be a red flag when we are performing the audit procedures. No, sir, quality dispute अगर कोई correspondence है आपने आपस में debtor और creditor के बीच में, vendor और customer के बीच में, in that case it is a dispute. Case need not be filed. अगर dispute चल रहा है आपस में कि because of which the payment is not being made, I think it should be classified as a disputed debtor or creditor. There could be arbitration, there could be आपस में letters being exchanged because of which it can be treated as a dispute. The definition of dispute is not given. It's left to the interpretation of the company concerned. But it would ideally mean wherein the payment is not being made because of any reason with respect to quality of the particular material, or with respect to the time of delivery, or with respect to acceptance not being done, goods not received by the particular customer. Could be any reason, but there should be letters being exchanged between the correspondence between the vendor and the customer should be. As per SA, external confirmation is not required for all the debtors and creditors. We have to have a scientific basis of sampling, which should include the debtors which are significant in terms of volume, which should include debtors wherein you are not able to perform alternative audit procedures. You may perform audit procedures in terms of subsequent payments, subsequent realizations also, whether the party is taking a bill-wise payment or on-account payment. So you have to identify the risk associated with specific debtor status based on which you perform an direct external confirmation. Any other questions from the audience? Any specific issues?
Yes, in last we will take 2 questions. After that we will go for the another session, भैया please. एक क्वेश्चन भैया ये आ रहा है कि can ECL to be categorized under the trade receivable?
Sorry, can
ECL expected credit loss. Debtors
नहीं, debtors Ind AS financials में expected credit loss तो आपको less करना ही पड़ेगा ना debtors. एक तरीके से वो तो less provision for doubtful debts हो गया ना.
Okay. अच्छा, एक नया डिस्क्लोजर एक आया है कि ट्रांजैक्शन विद द स्ट्राइक ऑफ कंपनी, राइट?
हाँ.
तो वी हैव टू फाइंड आउट द कंपनी जिससे ट्रांजैक्शन किया है, स्ट्राइक ऑफ करना. तो एज पर एमसीए डाटा कई बार हम लोग देखते हैं कि स्ट्राइक ऑफ नहीं है, लेकिन मार्च 18 या 19 के बाद कोई उन लोगों ने कंप्लायंस नहीं किया, नॉन कंप्लायंट है, या फिर कंपनी
आरओसी में अगर एक्टिव है, आरओसी में एक्टिव है तब कोई दिक्कत नहीं, चाहे वो एक्टिव नॉन कंप्लायंट हो, एक्टिव कंप्लायंट हो, उससे मतलब नहीं है. अगर स्ट्राइक ऑफ नहीं है अंडर द कंपनीज एक्ट डेटाबेस, देन इट इज ओके.
और लिक्विडेशन
भी नहीं होगा, स्ट्राइक ऑफ होना चाहिए.
अच्छा, तो ये तो डिस्क्लोजर नोट्स में आ गया. तो ऑडिट रिपोर्ट पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू से हम लोग को क्या लिखना चाहिए?
नहीं, कुछ नहीं. मतलब अगर आपका इन्वेस्टमेंट मटेरियल है, सपोज करिए वो स्ट्राइक ऑफ हो गया, तब तो आपको इन्वेस्टमेंट को राइट ऑफ करना चाहिए ना. वो अगर आपने राइट ऑफ नहीं किया तब प्रॉब्लम है.
अगर मान ले सर 3 करोड़ का डेटर्स है हमारा, वो अगर वो स्ट्राइक ऑफ हो गया है, इन दैट केस हाउ टू डिस्क्लोज इन द ऑडिटर रिपोर्ट?
तब सबसे पहला बात, आप 3 करोड़ का डेटर को आप कंटिन्यू कर रहे हो क्या?
तो वही चैलेंज है. मैनेजमेंट यदि बोलता है कि नहीं, डेटर्स वी विल रियलाइज द डेटर्स, बट नो कंफर्मेशन, नो कम्युनिकेशंस, हाउ टू?
तो कहां से करेंगे?
एग्जैक्टली.
हाँ, वो लोग अगर कंपनी एग्जिस्ट नहीं कर रहा तो आप कंफर्मेशन कहां से लोगे? या कोई डेटर, कोई और पार्टी ने अग्री किया पेमेंट करने के लिए, मतलब व्हाट इज द कॉरेस्पॉन्डेंस? तब वो डेटर उस पार्टी का तो नहीं खड़ा रहा जिसका स्ट्राइक ऑफ हुआ, कंपनी तो किसी और का नाम आना चाहिए.
एग्जैक्टली.
अगर डेटर उसी नाम से खड़ा है तो क्वेश्चन तो एसेट रहा ही नहीं ना कंपनी, मेरे पास एसेट के ऊपर कंट्रोल नहीं रहा.
एग्जैक्टली.
क्वेश्चन है आज के डेट में स्ट्राइक ऑफ है या नहीं. क्वेश्चन ये नहीं कि कंपनी रिवाइव हो सकता है 20 साल बाद या 10 साल बाद, वो नहीं है. आज के डेट में अपने जब ऑडिट साइन कर रहे हैं उस दिन स्ट्राइक ऑफ है या नहीं. अपने को वो टाइम स्टैम्प के साथ अपने को मास्टर डेटा को ठीक जनरेट कर लेना है, और वी शुड नॉट रिलाई ऑन Zoba Corp और एनी थर्ड पार्टी डेटाबेस, प्लीज अप्रिशिएट। कई बार मेरे साथ हुआ, एक कंपनी स्ट्राइक ऑफ था Zoba Corp में, बट इट वाज एक्टिव इन MC डेटाबेस। तो मतलब आई वाज वेरी सरप्राइज्ड लुकिंग एट दैट पर्टिकुलर कंपनी। So Zoba Corp cannot be relied always.
Sandeep, now you take over the sessions and start the further proceeding, please.
Thank you, Vivek ji. Now I request our secretary, CA near as a word, for formal vote of thanks to Vivek ji.
Sandeep, shall we, Vivek ji, will you be continuing with us for the moment?
So I am there, so you can start the session. So I am there. अपने लोग आपको आप जब भी एक पिंग कर दीजिएगा, just in case if I am not there, no problem. Let Ankita ji start.
That's why I'm asking Neeraj to give him formal vote of thanks. Otherwise, he may leave any time. We will not able to give him formal vote of thanks. So please.
नहीं, let us time बहुत exceed कर गया. हाँ, ठीक है, short कर दीजिए जितना जल्दी हो सके.
Okay. Thank you, Sandeep, and I'm first of all a very happy Friendship Day to all of us present on this virtual seminar. And after hearing Vivek's deliberations today on this important topic, I'm reminded of that famous dialogue of the movie Spider-Man: "With great power comes great responsibility." So we chartered accountants have been empowered with a lot of things. Our signature, our certificate carries great value. And along with that comes with great responsibility. And I think you have adequately and very nicely deliberated on the important aspects in Caro and what disclosures are required, what information is required before we sign a balance sheet for this financial year. So I, on behalf of our association, thank you, Vivek, for taking time out on a Sunday morning, especially on a Friendship Day, and sharing the details in full satisfaction to all of our viewers and participants. Thanks a lot. And on behalf of us, a small memento, a token of love, of appreciation to you. We'll arrange for handing it over to your office shortly. So thanks a lot.
Thank you.
If you have right now, you can show this memento to us also. Thank you. Thank you, Neeraj.
So thanks a lot, Vivek, once again.
Thank you.
And over to Anita ji for the next topic.
A very good afternoon to all. I think after this very enriching session by Vivek ji, now moving on to the NBFC sector and the regulatory framework compliances with respect to the NBFC sector. So now, before proceeding with what are the regulations or what are the prescriptions for the NBFC sector, let me give a brief background maybe on what exactly is an NBFC or how do we define an NBFC. बहुत ही सिंपली, बिकॉज सिंस वी अटेंडिंग दिस सेशन तो ये पता होना चाहिए कि बेसिकली एनबीएफसी हम कैसे करेंगे, कि कौन है एनबीएफसी. If we divide the term NBFC into three parts, non-banking financial company, सबसे important, it has to be a company. LLP is not a company. बहुत बार ऐसा होता है that LLP is carrying out financial activities and the question is asked whether it will also be classified as an NBFC and will RBI regulate it. No, that is not the case, because RBI regulations are restricted to an non-banking financial company, which is, it has to be in the form of a company registered under the Companies Act. Now, the term financial would mean that it is carrying out financial activities. Financial activities kya hai? That comes from the RBI Act. Now, if I have to say the main or the basic financial activities that an NBFC does, या तो लोन देता है, finance करता है, या investments करता है in shares and securities. So these are the two basic, you can say, activities, financial activities that are being conducted by an NBFC, and based on which I can determine whether a company is qualified to be classified as a NBFC or not. And the third most important point, it should not be a banking company. So an NBFC is not a bank. There are distinctions between a bank and an NBFC. We are not getting into that. But a non-banking financial company has to predominantly carry out financial activities in the form of a company. Now, when I say predominantly, what does it mean? It has to be more than 50% of its asset as well as income. So there are two basic criteria, principality test, जो हम लोग usual case में बोलते हैं, principal business test. that more than 50% of your assets, of your total assets, must be financial assets, and more than 50% of your gross income must come from these financial assets. Now, this is a duet condition, which means that I have to satisfy both these conditions to be able to prove that yes, it is an NBFC. If I'm satisfying only one of these conditions, say for suppose COVID के दौरान बहुत companies में ऐसा हुआ था कि मेरे पास excess funds थे and I would have invested in shares or securities. तो उस साल बहुत जन का assets जो था financial assets ज्यादा थे, क्योंकि मैंने financial because surplus funds था, काम नहीं हो रहा था, तो मैंने उसमें invest किया था जहां से मेरे को returns मिल पाए. So I must have invested in shares या मैंने किसी को loan दे दिया होगा. तो financial assets तो मेरे ज्यादा थे, but that does not mean कि मेरे financial income, उस asset से जो income आ रहा है in the form of dividend or interest, that was also more than 50%. So that may not be the case. Also, when I'm saying this, in certain cases ऐसा भी हो सकता था कि दोनों मेरा financial asset as well as income, both of these exceeded 50%. Now, in that case also, it is important to see that मेरा जो entity है, हो सकता है कि मेरा manufacturing business है, and I'm not intending to carry out financial activity, and it was just a one-time, you can say, breach of the principal business criteria. In that case, I have to ensure that board takes note of it, and ये एक time का जो breach है, इसकी वजह से it is not necessary that I go and register myself as an NBFC, because future में I may not be wanting to carry out financial activities or wanting to operate as a NBFC. So both the quantitative as well as qualitative factors have to be considered before I decide that this particular company satisfies these conditions and is intending to be a NBFC. Now, as a auditor, when I have to report for a particular company, whether it is breaching the criteria and meeting, तो मैं qualitative factors नहीं देख पाती हूँ. So I will be based, मतलब मेरा जो reporting होगा या my consideration would be based on the quantitative factors only, which is the principality test of 50-50. Qualitative factors will be provided by the management or the board of the company, and agar that is satisfactory, only then I'll be reporting as such. Okay, so an NBFC requires registration and it is required to maintain the NOF of 2 crore. अब अभी तक का जो मेरा present regulatory framework था, this has changed over a period of time. If we see 1998 में जब first time आया था, RBI को powers मिले थे to regulate the NBFC sector, and it was under chapter 3B that the RBI got its powers to lay down various regulations. Earlier there were circulars and notifications that were issued. Abhi kya ho gaya, master directions aa gaye. So now these master directions are a one point, you can say, compilation of all circulars and notifications that are issued by the RBI from time to time. So each major subject or each major category of NBFC has a master direction, and I can find all applicable regulations at one place. तो ऐसा नहीं कि मेरे को प्रूडेंशियल नॉर्म्स के लिए उसका मास्टर सर्कुलर देखना पड़ेगा, या मेरे को एफपीसी नॉर्म्स के लिए अलग से उसका मास्टर सर्कुलर या नोटिफिकेशन देखना होगा. एवरीथिंग कम्स अंडर द कॉमन अम्ब्रेला ऑफ अ मास्टर डायरेक्शन, be it a systemically important company or a non-systemically important company. Now, systemically important word से समझ में आ रहा है कि it is more important, मतलब उसका weightage थोड़ा ज़्यादा है. Weightage would be determined in terms of the asset size. Now, if it is an asset size of more than 500 crore, it is classified as systemically important. पहले ये जो criteria था, it was 100 crores, but then in 2004 it was revised to 500 crore. Now times are changing, and अभी फिर से एक revision आया है RBI का, which is the scale based regulations, SBR framework. We'll be coming to that. But उससे पहले अभी का जो present scenario है, उसमें क्या है? If I'm accepting deposit or I'm not accepting deposit, based on that the NBFC is classified deposit taking या non deposit taking. इंडिया में मोस्टली मैं देख लूं या कैलकाटा में मैं मोस्टली बोल दूं, it is non deposit taking NBFCs only जो यहाँ पे है, and non deposit taking NBFCs are further classified into systemically important या non systemically important. Now systemically important, as I mentioned, 500 crore से ऊपर अगर आपका asset size है. Now asset size would mean your balance sheet asset size. I am not going by कि क्या उसमें ब्रेकअप है एसेट्स का, बट टोटल जो मेरा बैलेंस शीट का वैल्यू है, टोटल एसेट्स, वो अगर मेरा 500 करोड़ से ऊपर है तो इट इज सिस्टमिकली इंपॉर्टेंट. If not, it is non-systemically important. Today's focus is more on non-systemically important NBFC, because for the audience as well as in Calcutta per se, there are basically more non-systemically important NBFCs rather than systemically important NBFCs. इसमें एक और चीज जो हम लोग को देखना है कि नॉन सिस्टमिक, जब भी मैं ये क्लासिफिकेशन कर रही हूँ बिटवीन सिस्टमिकली इंपॉर्टेंट और नॉन सिस्टमिकली इंपॉर्टेंट, देयर इज अ कंसेप्ट ऑफ aggregate of asset size. So what does that mean? It means that while I am actually seeing the asset size of one particular NBFC, अगर मेरे ग्रुप में और भी NBFCs हैं, तो I'll have to aggregate the assets of all those NBFCs so as to determine whether it is becoming systemically important or not. For example, one of the NBFCs have an asset size of 200 crores. The second NBFC has an asset size of 350 crores. Now, individually, both of these are non-systemically important. But since they are forming part of a group, I will have to aggregate the asset size of both the NBFCs, and I will have to apply the regulations on a cumulative basis. So accordingly, both these NBFCs will be classified as systemically important. So 200 plus 350 वो 550 हो रहा है, तो दोनों को मैं systemically important NBFC बोलूंगी, and दोनों के ऊपर जो मतलब NBFC SI के जो regulations है, that will become applicable. Now, as on date, there are various types of NBFC based on what kind of activity it is carrying out. Investment activities, lending activities. There are several other activities also, other forms of NBFCs, जैसे P2P हुआ, account aggregator हुआ. These may not be relevant for us. Our focus is more on the first two types, which is based on investment and lending activities. So if it is a pure investment company, and also in that pure investment company also, if my investments are restricted to investments in group companies, in that case, I will be classified as a core investment company. Now, core investment company जो होती है वो register होगी कि नहीं, उसका भी एक criteria है. Now, all NBFCs, मतलब अगर मैं देखूं कोई भी एक company है, say for suppose उसका more than 90% of its assets is in the form of investments in equity, preference to group companies, and more than 60% is in the form of equity investments only. तो ये दोनों क्राइटेरिया अगर मैं सेटिस्फाई कर रही हूँ, सो यस आई एम एन CIC, कोर इन्वेस्टमेंट कंपनी, बिकॉज मेरा मेजर इन्वेस्टमेंट्स बोल दीजिए और मेजर मेरा एक्सपोजर जो है मेरे ग्रुप कंपनीज में है. नाउ नेक्स्ट आई हैव टू सी कि इसका एसेट साइज कितना है. अगर इसका एसेट साइज 100 करोड़ से ऊपर है, तो पहले तो मैं देखूंगी कि इसका एसेट साइज कितना है. इफ इट इज मोर देन 100 करोड़, देन आई हैव टू सी वेदर इट इज हैविंग एक्सेस टू पब्लिक फंड्स और नॉट. Public funds would mean any outside liability be in the form of intercorporate deposit, किसी कंपनी से लोन लिया, किसी बैंक से लोन लिया, डिबेंचर्स इशू करके, कमर्शियल पेपर इशू करके, किसी भी फॉर्म का अगर मेरा बाहर का एक्सपोजर है, यानी पब्लिक फंड्स का मेरा एक्सेस है, एंड आई हैव एन एसेट साइज ऑफ मोर देन 100 crores, then that becomes a registered CIC. So that requires registration with the RBI, and it will be regulated by the RBI as per the regulations prescribed. However, if I am not meeting either of these two criteria would mean, if अगर मेरा या तो हो सकता है कि मैं 100 करोड़ से कम हूँ या मेरा पब्लिक फंड्स का एक्सेस नहीं है, दोनों में से कोई भी एक भी अगर मैं मीट नहीं कर रही हूँ, then I am not required to register, and hence I would be a unregistered NBFC and unregistered CIC. तो ये जो CIC का concept है, since it is investing majorly in its group companies, the RBI may not want to regulate it until and unless it is systemically very big, मतलब 100 करोड़ से ऊपर हो इसका asset size, या it is having access to गांव का पैसा, which is public funds. जब तक ये दोनों चीजें नहीं होती है, the RBI says that you can remain unregistered and you may not require registration with the RBI, or you may not have to follow the regulations prescribed by the RBI. Now, और दूसरा जो मेन NBFC जो कलकत्ता में मोस्टली हम लोग को देखने मिलता है, विच इज इन्वेस्टमेंट एंड क्रेडिट कंपनी, विच कैरीज आउट द मेन टू बिजनेस, मतलब जो नाम से ही पता चल रहा है, इन्वेस्टमेंट एक्टिविटीज एंड लेंडिंग एक्टिविटीज, ईदर ऑफ इट और बोथ ऑफ इट अगर मैं कर रही हूँ, तो दैट विल बी एन NBFC ICC. नाउ दिस इज जस्ट अ scale you can say to see whether it is an NBFC, क्योंकि 50% से ज्यादा अगर मेरा assets हो रहा है तभी मैं NBFC हूँ, उससे पहले मैं NBFC भी नहीं हूँ. 50% से ऊपर है and 90% तक ये, तब I am in I am an NBFC ICC, which is investment and credit company, and if it is more than 90% and that also only in group companies, then I am classified as a CIC. अच्छा, now as I mentioned कि अब जो है RBI is actually changing its regulatory framework. तो अभी जब हमने अभी का present scenario एक बार पता चल गया कि current ये classification and this is the regulatory approach. Now let us see what is coming up next. Now from 1st October onwards, the scale-based regulations will become applicable. Under the scale-based regulations, what is happening? The NBFCs are being divided into 4 levels or 4 categories. I would not say 4 levels, depending on various factors. ये जो 4 level हमने यहाँ पे हम लोग को screen पे भी दिख रहा है, top, upper, middle and base. Now इसका अगर मैं मतलब intent देखूं तो RBI का intent यही था कि कुछ NBFCs जो कि बहुत ज्यादा important हो रही है, बहुत ज्यादा बड़ी हो रही है, उनको बैंक के जितना regulate करना जरूरी है. And at the same time, there are several other NBFCs, smaller NBFCs, जो हो सकता है उतना lending activity, उतना investment activity नहीं कर रही है, just a part of a group में बस पैसे लगाने के लिए, या फिर even if not a part of the group, but सिर्फ minor मतलब छोटे मोटे activities, financial activities करने के लिए अगर वो business कर रही है, so उनको मेरे को बहुत ज़्यादा regulations उनके ऊपर नहीं apply करने. So the idea was to actually deregulate certain types of NBFCs, उनके ऊपर regulations कम लाने थे, and at the same time I have to put stringent regulations on the top layer NBFCs. Now this scale-based regulation has divided NBFCs into 4 layers. Base layer would comprise of such NBFCs that have an asset size of less than 1,000 crore. तो पहले 100 करोड़ था जो सिस्टमिकली इंपॉर्टेंट एनबीएफसी होने के लिए, उसके बाद वो 500 करोड़ हुआ जो कि आज के डेट में भी एप्लीकेबल है. more than 500 crore is a systemically important NBFC, and now it has again been you can say extended to 1,000 crores. So below 1,000 crores, all NBFCs, now this 1,000 crores is also the asset size, all NBFCs will fall in the base level. Middle layer में कौन आएंगे? Which is more than 1,000 crores. डिपॉजिट टेकिंग अगर है तो वो बेस लेयर में नहीं आएगा, ऑटोमेटिकली वो मिडिल लेयर में ही आ जाएगा. अपर लेयर में वो सारी एनबीएफसीज आएंगे जो आरबीआई स्पेसिफिकली बेस्ड ऑन द फैक्टर्स, मतलब वो जो फिल्टरिंग प्रोसेस वो करेगा बेस्ड ऑन द साइज कि टॉप 10 को तो मेरे को इंक्लूड करना ही है अपर लेयर में, एंड ऑल्सो सम अदर फिल्टरिंग प्रोसेस लाइक उसका क्या कनेक्टिविटी, इंटरकनेक्टेडनेस कितना है, साइज उसका कितना बड़ा है. सो वेटेज देते हुए it will determine whether a particular NBFC needs to be put in the upper layer or not. आज का फोकस हम लोग का basically is on the middle layer. Also CIC, which we were talking about, core investment companies will fall in the middle layer. And अगर मेरी NBFC है जिसमें customer interface या public funds का access नहीं है, that would be a type 1 NBFC and it will automatically fall in base layer irrespective of the asset size. तो यहाँ पे 2 चीजें इंपॉर्टेंट है. एक तो कोई भी एनबीएफसी जिसमें पब्लिक फंड्स नहीं है और कस्टमर इंटरफेस नहीं है, विच इज टाइप 1, उसमें इररिस्पेक्टिव ऑफ द एसेट साइज वो बेस लेयर में ही रहेगी हमेशा. दूसरा, अगर हो सकता है कि मैंने कभी लेंडिंग एक्टिविटी किया हो या फिर मैंने किसी से बोरोइंग की हो, सो इन दैट केस आई एम नॉट अ टाइप 1 एनबीएफसी, आई एम अ टाइप 2 एनबीएफसी. इन दैट केस अप टिल द एसेट साइज ऑफ 1,000 crores I will fall in the base layer. Post exceeding the asset size of 1,000 crores, I will fall in the middle layer. So peer-to-peer account aggregator, these may not be important for us, but basically जो main 2 important थे, type 1 NBFC जो हमेशा base layer में होगी और बाकी NBFCs के लिए 1,000 crores तक अगर है तो वो base layer में, उससे ऊपर वो middle layer में, and CICs will always remain in the middle layer until unless they fall in the upper layer. Now this is the various categories of NBFCs and वो कहाँ पे classify होंगे, चाहे वो गवर्नमेंट सेक्टर हो, गवर्नमेंट ओन NBFC हो, HFCs हो. तो मेरा यहाँ पे मेन तो कंसर्न यही है, इन्वेस्टमेंट एंड क्रेडिट कंपनी, और इन्वेस्टमेंट एंड क्रेडिट कंपनी में भी वी आर नॉट टेकिंग डिपॉजिट. सो यहाँ पे 2 क्राइटेरिया है, या तो मेरे पास कस्टमर इंटरफेस और पब्लिक फंड्स दोनों ही नहीं है, सो आई एम ऑलवेज फॉलोइंग इन दिस बेस लेयर, या अगर दोनों में से कोई भी एक है, सो इन दैट केस लेस देन 1,000 crores बेस लेयर एंड मोर देन 1,000 crore विल फॉल ईदर इन द मिडिल लेयर और अपर लेयर, डिपेंडिंग ऑन वो कितना उसका एसेट साइज है 1,000 crore से ऊपर होने के बाद. तो in terms of numbers, this is just maybe statistical figure that is provided कि as on date कितने NBFCs हैं which is falling into a particular category. So आप देखेंगे mostly जो होगा more than I think 9,000 NBFCs will fall in the base layer itself. So it is important to know कि base layer के ऊपर क्या-क्या changes आ रहे हैं. So सबसे पहला और सबसे major change is in terms of NOF requirement. स्टार्टिंग में मैंने कहा था कि एनबीएफसी जब रजिस्टर होने जाती है तो 2 करोड़ का उसका एक एनओएफ रिक्वायरमेंट है. सो इट इज अ कंपनी हैविंग इक्विटी और कंपल्सरी कन्वर्टेबल प्रेफरेंस शेयर्स जो मेरा ओन फंड्स में ला रही हूँ. एनओएफ जब मैं कंप्यूट करती हूँ that has to be at least 2 crore as on date. Now this has been increased to 10 crores. अब ये किस किस कैटेगरीज के लिए इंक्रीज हुआ? It has been increased for all other ICC except ICC जिसमें पब्लिक फंड्स और कस्टमर इंटरफेस में. सो आप देखेंगे कि बार बार मैं ये वाले चीज पे एम्फेसाइज कर रही हूँ कि पब्लिक फंड्स एंड कस्टमर इंटरफेस नहीं है. सो व्हेन एन एनबीएफसी डज नॉट have access to public funds or is not having any customer interface, it is actually exempted from a lot of requirements. मतलब उसके ऊपर जो regulatory आप बोल सकते हैं guidelines हैं वो बहुत ज्यादा कम stringent है as compared to other NBFCs. So if I am not having access to public funds and I am not having any customer interface, तब मेरे को ये 2 करोड़ का जो NOF है मेरे लिए वही applicable रहेगा and I don't have to increase it to 10 crores. But if I am an NBFC which has either of it, मतलब मेरे पास या तो public funds या customer interface कोई भी एक चीज है, so then I will have to increase my NOF to 10 crores. Now that has to be done in a phased manner. ऐसा नहीं है कि ये 1 अक्टूबर से applicable है और उसी समय मुझे 10 करोड़ करना है, but in a phased manner 2025 तक मेरे को 5 करोड़ करना है, 2027 तक मेरे को 10 करोड़ करना है. कोई भी नई एनबीएफसी अगर मैं अभी बनाने जाऊंगी तो उसको स्टार्टिंग डे से ही 10 करोड़ का एनओएफ लेके चलना है. ओनली फॉर एग्जिस्टिंग एनबीएफसीज देयर इज अ phased manner applicability of the NOF requirement that has been prescribed. So उन लोग को अलाउ किया गया कि they can actually increase their NOF over a period of 4 years. अभी 25 तक 5 करोड़ and 27 तक 10 करोड़. Otherwise, all other new NBFCs will have to have an asset size of 10 crores itself on the day they register themselves. Now, there are several other regulatory requirements that have come into picture because of the SBR framework. तो SBR के अंदर एक जो ये NOF का हमने डिस्कस किया वो है. उसके अलावा जो NPA norms है, we all know that an NBFC has to classify its assets into categories: standard, substandard, doubtful, and loss asset. तो NPA हम लोग कब बोलते हैं? All systemically important NBFCs के लिए as on date NPA is more than 90 days. But smaller NBFCs which have an asset size of less than 500 crore, उनका अभी भी NPA requirement is 180 days. So only after the default मतलब continuously stays for 180 days. So if there is a DPD of more than 180 days, only then a loan asset is classified as NPA. Now, this will change in a phased manner and it will be bought at parity with other NBFCs. तो सबके लिए फिर वो 90 DPD वाला NPA categorization हो जाएगा. 2024 का जब मैं financials देखूंगी तब उस समय मेरे को देखना 150 days से ऊपर भी अगर कोई है तो उसको मेरे को NPA क्लासिफाई करना है. 2025 में 120 days and 2026 में 90 days. So in a phased manner, I have to ensure that this NPA norms are bought at par with the existing NPA norms of larger NBFCs. There is a requirement to have a director in the company who has relevant experience of having worked in a bank or NBFC. Now, this I know is not a very practical sort of a requirement because बहुत बार क्या होती है जो family NBFCs होते हैं वहाँ पे it can be the husband and wife who are the directors or it can be professionally managed. But RBI का बोलना है कि if you are in the NBFC sector, अगर आप एक NBFC चला रहे हैं, irrespective of having access to public funds or not, irrespective of having customer interface or not, at least एक director ऐसा लाइए जिसको relevant experience हो, या तो किसी बैंक में काम करने का या NBFC में काम करने का. अभी तक ये वाला जो रिक्वायरमेंट है इसको लेकर आरबीआई ने मतलब ऐसा कुछ क्लैरिटी नहीं दिया कि विच हु ऑल विल बी एलिजिबल, मतलब किसी एक सीए को भी अगर मैं डायरेक्टर दिखा दूं विल दैट आल्सो वर्क और नॉट, या मैं किसी एक कंपनी में किसी एक ऐसे मतलब प्रोफेशनल बेसिस पे किसी एक आदमी को इंडिपेंडेंट डायरेक्टर दिखा दो whether that will work or not. Though there is no clarity, but the intent seems to be that RBI wants someone on the board which is having an experience in the NBFC or the banking sector. मतलब उसको वो बिजनेस समझ में आता हो, ऐसा नहीं हो कि हस्बैंड वाइफ बोर्ड में है जिनको बिजनेस के बारे में पता ही नहीं है and it is just being managed by someone else. So they want that on the board level as well there has to be a person who has relevant experience of working in a NBFC or a bank. IPO funding mostly छोटे NBFCs करते नहीं है, तो that is not relevant, but there has been a ceiling that has been put on IPO funding 1 crore per borrower, उससे ज्यादा का funding नहीं कर सकते. This is already applicable from 1st April itself and we don't have to wait for 1st October. Rest of the provisions are applicable from 1st October this year. Now यहाँ पे भी बहुत सारे रिक्वायरमेंट्स है जो कि बड़ी मिडिल लेयर या अपर लेयर एनबीएफसीज के ऊपर होंगे, तो आई मे जस्ट स्किप दीज बिकॉज आई कैप रिक्वायरमेंट या सीईटी कैपिटल मेंटेन करने का रिक्वायरमेंट, दीज आर नॉट एप्लीकेबल ऑन स्मॉलर एनबीएफसीज व्हिच विल फॉल इन द बेस लेयर. व्हाट इज एप्लीकेबल ऑन द बेस लेयर इज दिस कॉर्पोरेट गवर्नेंस, जो कि पहले सिर्फ सिस्टमिकली इंपॉर्टेंट कंपनीज के लिए आता था, अब कॉर्पोरेट गवर्नेंस के कुछ एक चीजें यहाँ पे भी एप्लीकेबल हो रही है ऑन द बेस लेयर एंटिटीज. सो रिस्क मैनेजमेंट कमिटी, पहले सिर्फ सिस्टमिकली इंपॉर्टेंट या लार्जर एनबीएफसीज यूज्ड टू कॉन्स्टिट्यूट दिस कमिटी, बट हाल फिलहाल में व्हेन आरबीआई ऑब्जर्व दैट लिक्विडिटी रिस्क इज समथिंग दैट हैज टू बी मॉनिटर्ड, दैट हैज टू बी मैनेज्ड प्रॉपर्ली बाय all levels of NBFCs, they had provided this provision ki you have to constitute a risk management committee at a board or executive level. The main role of this risk management committee would be to see the overall risk that is being faced by the NBFC as well as specifically the liquidity risk that is faced by any NBFC. Now the ALM positioning, मेरा जो asset liability का mismatch होता है उसको किस हिसाब से मैं manage कर रही हूँ, these things become important for all NBFCs irrespective of asset size, and the responsibility will be on the risk management committee. Several disclosure requirements have been included. Now disclosure requirement जो already अभी है, उसके अलावा कुछ एक और disclosure requirements आए हैं which in the later slide we'll be dealing in detail, and also a board approved policy requirement for granting loans to directors or senior officers or relatives of directors. So this is a requirement for base layer entities specifically. Middle layer और upper layer के लिए तो limits भी आ गए कि आप अगर 5 करोड़ से ऊपर दे रहे हैं तो अप्रूवल लेके देना होगा, 5 करोड़ से नीचे दे रहे हैं तो बोर्ड में नोट करवाना होगा. बेस लेयर के ऊपर ये लिमिट्स एप्लीकेबल नहीं है. However, RBI has said कि आप लोग एक पॉलिसी बना के रख दीजिए अपने इंटरनल लिमिट्स के हिसाब से, सो एज टू इंश्योर कि अगर आप कोई भी लोन दे रहे हैं डायरेक्टर या सीनियर ऑफिसर या उनके रिलेटिव्स को और 2 एंटिटीज जिनका और रिलेटिव्स जिनका मेजर शेयर होल्डिंग है इन दी कंपनी, उनको अगर आप लोन दे रहे हैं तो इट इज रेगुलेटेड. So coming to the disclosure requirement first, कि क्या disclosure requirement है, इसका applicability since ये applicable हो रहा है, the SBR is getting applicable from 1st October 2022. तो financials जो मैं next year बनाऊंगी for the financial year 22-23, उस केस में मेरे को ध्यान रखने हैं कि ये additional disclosures भी financials में included हो. So disclosure with respect to exposure in real estate, in capital market, sectoral exposure, ये सब तो तभी आते हैं जब मेरा ऐसा कोई लेंडिंग किया हुआ हो, which in many मतलब most common जो होगा कि ये सब कोई नहीं हो सकता है, मतलब बहुत रेयर ऐसा होगा कि it will be an exposure to real estate or capital market or there will be any sectoral exposure. Different sectors का जो भी exposure है वो मेरे को bifurcate करके दिखाना है. तो अगर मैं lending उतना कर रही हूँ तभी मेरे को ये सारे exposures मतलब डिटेल में देखने पड़ेंगे. इंटर ग्रुप एक्सपोजर्स जो मोस्ट कॉमनली होता है कि ग्रुप एंटिटीज में मैं लेंड कर रही हूँ, रिलेटेड पार्टीज को लेंड कर रही हूँ, दैट हैज टू बी डिस्क्लोज्ड स्पेसिफिकली अंडर इंटर ग्रुप एक्सपोजर. इसका पूरा फॉर्मेट दिया हुआ है. किस किस हेडिंग में क्या क्या चीजें आएंगी, all that has been prescribed by the RBI. Unhedged foreign currency exposure may not be relevant for us. Related party disclosure ये पूरा नया आया है, and इसके अंदर what is new, मतलब related party disclosure as it is in AS 18 और ये सब के अंदर मैं already कर रही हूँ, but what is new over here is that outstanding at the year end and the maximum during the year are to be disclosed. So it is not just मतलब financials जो हम लोग बनाते हैं, usual हम लोग का ये रहता है कि we will be reporting the figures as on the year end date, but this time onwards, this financial year जो आने वाला है, उसमें जब मैं report करूंगी, it will not just be the outstanding amount as at the year end, but also the maximum during the year. So अगर कोई भी exposure मैंने related party के ऊपर लिया है in terms of borrowing, advance, investment, anything, if साल के दौरान भी मैं करके उसको वापस से disinvest कर लूं या लोन का repayment हो गया, I have to show that, I have to report that as well. So any transaction done during the year also, if that is the maximum amount, it is more than what is outstanding at the year end, that has to be reported. Disclosure of complaints, that is relevant only if we are having customers as such, मतलब जो retail lending और करते हैं उनके लिए ये ज़्यादा relevant होगा, not otherwise. Now loans and advances का जो मैं बता रही थी कि middle layer and upper layer के ऊपर ये restriction आया है that more than 5 crore you have to do only with the approval of the board of directors, and less than 5 crores it can be done without the approval, but you need to get it reported to the board of directors, senior officers और ये सब के लिए भी है. But what is interesting to know कि base layer NBFCs के लिए ये सब restriction नहीं है. It is only that you need to have a policy in place and internal limits. Disclosure requirement इसके अंदर भी है. तो any loans and advances to directors and senior officers have to be disclosed in your annual financial statement. Previous year और current year दोनों का disclose करना है. This also becomes applicable जो next year का मैं financials बनाऊंगी for the financial year 22-23, उसमें मेरे को ये disclose करना होगा. Several other corporate governance provisions that become applicable are not applicable on the base layer, so they have been notified only for middle layer and upper layer. This is a small summary of what all regulations are coming in picture after the introduction of the SBR framework. Now current provisions जो है अभी आज के दिन उससे लेकर भी बहुत बार होता है कि we have queries or we have concerns कि उसमें भी clarity नहीं है. तो आज के दिन में if I see there are master directions as I mentioned in the beginning itself, जहाँ पे मेरे को सारा जो भी provisions applicable है on the company that I get to see under the master directions itself. So there are several master directions for each category of NBFC. अगर systemically important है तो उसका master direction अलग है, deposit taking है तो उसका अलग है, non-systemically important NBFC तो उसका अलग है, CIC का भी अलग है. Then there are several other master directions specifically for fraud reporting, IT framework. Fraud reporting is not applicable on smaller or non-systemically important NBFCs. IT framework is applicable on all. Then there is returns का एक अलग से direction है and auditors report का भी अलग से एक master direction है. So all the requirements that are applicable on the NBFCs come from these master direction itself. कोई भी साल के दौरान भी अगर कोई notification या circular आता है तो RBI directions को ही amend करके उसको ही update कर देता है and the notification gets embedded in the directions itself. So I can refer to the master direction. What are the current provisions of master direction that are applicable on an NBFC, on a small NBFC? These would include from fair practices code to prudential regulations, miscellaneous instruction, factors or IDF or MFI के लिए जो specific directions that may not be very much relevant for us. Change in control is again an important discussion that we'll be doing. And there are also several annexures. So इसमें एक important annexure liquidity risk management framework. Now liquidity risk management framework will come to that also, but that is applicable only if you have an asset size of more than 100 crore. उसमें भी एक disclosure requirement है जो कि financials का part बनना चाहिए. Schedule to balance sheet of an NBFC. ये एक you can say it is a separate disclosure requirement जो कि RBI ने prescribe किया in annexure 3. ये जो इसका जो applicability है, it will not be applicable if your company is not having access to public funds. तो अगर कंपनी ने कोई भी लोन नहीं लिया है कभी भी बैंक फाइनेंस लोन या कुछ भी कोई भी बाहर से पैसे नहीं लिए, इट इज जस्ट हैविंग इक्विटी इन इट्स कंपनी, ओन खुद का पैसा मतलब ओन फंड्स ही है, तो in that case this is not applicable because prudential norms applicable नहीं होते, and this schedule to balance sheet is a requirement under prudential norms. Norms on restructuring, if you're doing that, information about proposed promoters, directors, shareholders जो हम लोग को inform करना पड़ता है कभी भी अगर कोई भी director नया आया है या shareholder आया है, in certain cases approval is required, and in all cases an intimation is to be sent to the RBI informing about such change, even if there is a change in auditor. Private placement of entities, अगर NCD issuance कर रहे हैं private placement basis पे, so that also has specific guidelines कि किस तरह के entities होंगे जो आप पैसे ले सकते हैं, and it will not be classified as a deposit. Outsourcing अगर हो रहा है तो, and Ind AS in case applicable है, smaller NBFCs में mostly नहीं होंगे, तो assuming it is not applicable may not be right. Now, as I mentioned, कि master direction is a one point, you can say reference point कि क्या क्या चीजें मेरे पे applicable है. अब master direction के अंदर भी all the prescriptions that are laid down there may not be entirely applicable on me, depending upon whether I am having access to public funds and I am having any customer interface or not. The applicability will be determined. So if I am having both customer interface as well as public funds, entire directions are applicable on me. If I'm having customer interface, but I'm not having access to public funds, entire direction except prudential norms. Prudential norms would mean the asset classification norm, जो अभी मैंने schedule बताया था Annex 3 वाला, वो भी मेरे पे applicable नहीं होगा. In case I'm not having customer interface, but I'm having public funds, तो customer related जो भी regulations होते हैं, जैसे कि FPC हुआ, Fair Practice Code, KYC हुआ, CIC में जो registration requirement है, that is not applicable on the company. If I don't have either of it, मतलब मैं type 1 NBFC हूँ, तो मैं एक तो irrespective of my asset size, I will always fall in the base layer itself, and there are several other exemptions that I get. मेरे को 2 करोड़ का NOF रखना पड़ेगा. I will not be required to comply with FPC, KYC, CIC में register नहीं करना होगा, prudential norms नहीं लगेंगे, LRM framework तक मेरे को exempt. So if I'm not having any customer interface or public funds, these NBFCs, smaller or big in size as well, they are exempted from a whole lot of regulatory requirements. What is customer interface and public funds? For those who are maybe curious to know कि public funds में क्या क्या चीजें आएंगी, any public deposit, intercorporate deposits, bank finance, commercial paper, debentures. 5 जो मेन कैटेगरीज ऑफ पब्लिक फंड्स होते हैं वो यही है. तो किसी भी रूप में अगर मैं फंडिंग रेज कर रही हूँ इन दीज फॉर्म्स, देन इट विल बी रिगार्डेड एज पब्लिक फंड्स. Customer interface would mean interaction between the NBFC and its customer while carrying on its business. अब ये बहुत ही vague सा definition है जो RBI ने लिख दिया, that it is an interaction between NBFC and its customer while carrying on its business. Now we have to understand that NBFC will be carrying on what business? If I'm investing in a company, does that company becomes my customer? No, because I'm not interacting with that company. I'm just investing in the shares of that company. अगर कोई listed company हुई, या for that matter even unlisted company, I'm just taking an exposure by investing. मैं तो बस पैसे उसको दे रहा हूँ और उसमें मेरे को return में देंगे. However, if it is a loan transaction, it cannot, the same theory does not apply, because in case of a loan transaction, I am actually interacting with the customer in terms of explaining him the loan products, because that is the offering that I am doing. कि मैं इस type का loan दूंगा, इतना rate of interest पे दूंगा, ये terms of repayment होंगे. So if that is an interaction that I am having, so if it is a lending transaction that I am entering into, then I would be said to have customer interface. But if it is purely investment, that will not be regarded as customer interface. Compliances, once I'm registered, I have to pass this resolution that I'll not receive any public deposit. ये every year मेरे को pass करना होता है, and this has to be ensured, because आपको भी अपने reporting में जो आप statutory auditor certificate देते हैं उसमें भी आपको ये चीज पूछा जाता है whether the company had accepted any public deposit or not. तो साल के शुरुआत में company ये resolution pass कर लेती है first board meeting में ही, that I will not be accepting any public deposit since I am a non-deposit taking NBFC. जो necessary policies है, कुछ एक ये जो basic policies है, FPC या KYC, interest rate, credit policy, these also have to be adopted by the company if applicable on the company. Principal officer or designated director is again an important thing that has to be appointed, and you have to register with FIU-IND. अब FIU-IND का registration, why is it important? Because कुछ साल पहले, I think 4-5 years ago, ये आया था कि बहुत सारे NBFCs को defaulted companies, मतलब पूरा एक list निकाल दिया गया था कि these are defaulted companies. Now the default उन बेचारों का क्या था? सिर्फ यही कि उन्होंने अपने आप को FIU-IND में register नहीं किया था. It is just a matter of registering your company with it and specifying 2 of your employees as one as principal officer and designated director. अब कभी कोई reporting वैसा requirement आता है कि कोई suspicious transaction हुआ या फिर कोई cash transaction वैसा हुआ जो कि reporting करने के लिए है, in that case only I have to report to FIU, नहीं तो सिर्फ वो registration का formality है जो मेरे को करना है. CICs के साथ भी if I'm having customer interface नहीं था तो I saw कि यहाँ पे CIC registration was exempted, but if I'm having customer interface then I have to register with all 4 CICs. A very common question that comes is that सिर्फ एक CIC से करना है कि चारों से करना है. तो अब 4 CICs हैं, RBI चाहते हैं कि आप चारों के पास करें. I know there is a duplicacy of information that is being done because पैसे लगते हैं हर एक के registration के साथ उसके renewal के लिए, but the requirement stays. If you have a customer interface, then you have to register with all 4 CICs. TKYC or NESL or SARSAI only to the extent it is applicable, which in most of the cases may not be. Well, it is more from the perspective अगर mortgage कुछ create हुआ है, कोई security interest हुआ है, तब जाके SARSAI में होगा. NESL में भी debt related है. अगर आप उसके खिलाफ insolvency या bankruptcy का case करना चाह रहे हैं या सोच रहे हैं, in that case it is preferred that you submit those information with NESL so as to ensure कि आपको वो priority मिले, आपका वो debt जो है वो recognize हो in the IBC proceedings. So before moving ahead with the present regulations that are there applicable, if there are questions, maybe we can take that up at this stage. One is that from where do we draw the definition of group? The definition of group company is prescribed by the RBI itself. ये master direction में ही दिया हुआ है. I may not have covered it in this presentation, but it is prescribed under the master direction itself. Now group के अंदर क्या क्या आएगा? All subsidiary और parent subsidiary और holding आ जाएगा, related party कोई भी है वो आ जाएगा, associate company आ जाएगा, even if they are sharing a common brand name या मैंने 20% से ज्यादा invest कर रखा है किसी कंपनी में, all of these will come under the definition of group company. Can you please explain NBFC factor company? Sure. So NBFC पहले हम लोग को समझना होगा कि factoring क्या है. Now अभी फिलहाल जो change आया है factoring regulations में भी, factoring act के अंदर, factoring is the business wherein I am actually discounting invoice. मतलब मैं क्या कर रही हूँ, जैसे कि आज किसी MSME ने गुड्स बेचे हैं एंड आई एम एक्चुअली उस गुड्स के बदले उसने मेरे ऊपर इनवॉइस रेस कर दिया है, उस इनवॉइस को जाके वो किसी एक NBFC से या बैंक से डिस्काउंट करवा रहे हैं कि मेरे को तो पैसे 60 डेज बाद मिलेंगे, आप मेरे को अपफ्रंट दे दीजिए. सो दैट डिस्काउंटिंग दैट आई एम डूइंग कि मैंने आपको इनवॉइस ट्रांसफर कर दिया, मैंने आपको इनवॉइस जो असाइन कर दिया, इफ आई एम डूइंग दैट, इन दैट केस इट इज अ फैक्टरिंग एक्टिविटी. पहले फैक्टरिंग एक्टिविटी जो था उसको लेकर बहुत डिबेट होता था कि वो क्या सब NBFCs कर सकते हैं कि नहीं, या सिर्फ NBFC फैक्टर कर सकता है. तो अभी इसको लेकर कुछ एक क्लैरिटी आया है. पहला क्लैरिटी ये है कि फैक्टरिंग डेफिनेशन से एक एग्जेम्पशन मिला है जो कि पहले सिर्फ बैंक्स को था, अब NBFCs को भी मिल गया. सो इफ इट इज अ क्रेडिट फैसिलिटी दैट आई एम एक्सटेंडिंग against the security of receivables, that is not considered as factoring. I repeat myself, if it is a credit facility, I'm giving a loan and it is against the security of receivables, मतलब मैं जो लोन दे रही हूँ आपको, मैं बोल रही हूँ कि अगर आप डिफॉल्ट करते तो आपके जो रिसीवेबल्स है, जो आपको पैसे मिलने हैं, वो उसके ऊपर मेरा सिक्योरिटी इंटरेस्ट है. So that I will invoke that security interest if in case you default. So I'm not assigning those receivables, but what I'm doing is I'm providing a credit facility and it is secured by those receivables. So this is not considered as factoring and it is exempted by the definition of factoring. इसके अलावा अगर आप कुछ करते हैं जहाँ पे आप एक्चुअली असाइन कर रहे हैं वो रिसीवेबल्स को, या आप मेरे को डिस्काउंट करवा रहे हैं उस रिसीवेबल्स का, मेरे इनवॉइस डिस्काउंट करवा रहे हैं, इट कैन बी रिवर्स फैक्टरिंग. मतलब रिवर्स फैक्टरिंग ये होगा जहाँ पे कि कंपनी जिसके ऊपर इनवॉइस रेज हुई थी वही जाके करवा रहा है एंड नॉर्मल फैक्टरिंग होता है जिसने इनवॉइस रेज किया तो वो जाके अपना डिस्काउंटिंग करवा रहा है. So both these cases can be done only by an NBFC factor. Even an NBFC can register. मतलब normal NBFC ICC भी जो है वो भी फैक्टरिंग एक्टिविटीज कैरी आउट कर सकता है, बट उसके लिए उसको स्पेसिफिकली आरबीआई से रजिस्ट्रेशन लेना होगा, नॉट एज एन एनबीएफसी फैक्टर. मतलब एनबीएफसी फैक्टर तो वो हो गया जो प्रिंसिपली फिर वही कर रहा है कि उसका मोर देन 50% of its assets and income are in factoring business only. But normal NBFC ICC भी factoring कर सकता है as a non-principal business. उस केस में उसको आरबीआई से लेकिन जाकर रजिस्ट्रेशन लेना होगा, एंड देयर आर सेट ऑफ रिक्वायरमेंट्स कि आपका ये एलिजिबिलिटी आप मीट कर रहे हैं कि नहीं, एसेट साइज एंड ऑल वो सब प्रिस्क्राइब किया है. I hope this is clear, Ajay ji. And then Ashok ji is asking, case common director will applicable for group company. So are you asking that if there are common directors between two companies, will it be considered as a group company or not? So in that case, I have to see whether it is falling under the definition of group company as a related party. क्या मैं उसको दिखा रही हूँ? Because I think related party का जो definition है AS 18 के अंदर वो बहुत broad है. अगर उसके अंदर वो कंपनी फॉल कर रही है तो yes, that becomes a group company. आरबीआई ने खुद का ऐसा कोई प्रिस्क्रिप्शन नहीं दिया. आरबीआई ने सीधा क्या किया, रेफरेंस दे दिया कि आप होल्डिंग सब्सिडियरी अंडर द एप्लीकेबल एएस वो देख लो, आप एसोसिएट हो वो आप देख लो, अगर आप रिलेटेड पार्टी हो वो आप देख लो, कॉमन ब्रांड नेम है वो आप देख लो, 20% से ज्यादा इन्वेस्ट किया है वो आप देख लो. तो अगर इनमें से कहीं पे भी आप फॉल कर रहे हैं तो यस, यू विल बी रिगार्डेड एज अ ग्रुप कंपनी. नेक्स्ट, ओके, यही एक था. आई होप दैट इज क्लियर. Are there any further questions at this stage? Yes, someone has unmuted. If someone wants to maybe say something, unmute करके अगर आपको कुछ बोलना है या पूछना है, so if not, then maybe we'll just proceed. Okay.
Please proceed.
Yeah. So leverage requirement जो कि बहुत कॉमन मतलब स्मॉलर एनबीएफसीज के ऊपर एप्लीकेबल, कितना मैं बाहर से लाइबिलिटी रेज कर सकती हूँ. सो दैट हैज टू बी इंश्योर्ड कि 7 टाइम्स से ज्यादा नहीं हो. आउटसाइड लाइबिलिटीज वुड इंक्लूड ऑल, मतलब टोटल लाइबिलिटीज जो मेरे बैलेंस शीट के लाइबिलिटी साइड में आ रहा है, एक्सेप्ट माय पेड अप कैपिटल बिकॉज वो मेरा खुद का पैसा है, रिजर्व्स एंड ऑल्सो कंपनी का खुद का पैसा, या कंपल्सरी कन्वर्टेबल इक्विटी. एक्सेप्ट दीज, इफ देयर आर एनीथिंग दैट on the liability side of the balance sheet, that will be considered as outside liability. That cannot be more than 7 times of my own funds, which is consisting of जो मैंने छोड़ दिया था liability side में, which is paid up, preference shares जो कि compulsory convertible है, free reserves, balance share premium account, all these have to be considered as own fund, and इसका 7 times तक ही मैं outside liabilities raise कर सकती हूँ. This is something that has to be ensured at all times by smaller NBFCs. Larger NBFCs के लिए CRAR का requirement है, which is capital risk adequacy. They have to risk weight their assets and उसके हिसाब से देखना है whether adequate capital is maintained or not. But smaller NBFCs have to ensure the leverage is maintained at all times. Deposit is again an important part. यहाँ पे deposits related, while Vivek ji was also explaining, so उस समय भी बहुत सारे questions आए थे whether this will be considered as deposit or not. One such question was with respect to HUF. Now, just to add to what Vivek ji said, HUF को लेकर 2 views हैं. It is not always that अगर मैं HUF से loan ले रही हूँ तो उसको मैं relative नहीं मानूंगी, क्योंकि अगर relative से loan लेना exempted है, मतलब not for an NBFC, but अगर relative से loan लेना exempted है and director is a you can say the कर्ता of the HUF. So अगर director के relative से loan लेना exempted है, HUF में और कौन है, सब director के relatives ही हैं, and I cannot treat HUF as something beyond what it is मतलब made up of. So उसमें सब relatives ही अगर हैं तो HUF को मैं अलग से क्यों treat करूँ? It is also a relative then. So ये व्यू भी एक है मार्केट में कि HUF को भी अगर रिलेटिव के जैसे ही ट्रीट करते हैं तो हो सकता है कि उससे भी हम लोग लोन ले सकते हैं. But I would now leave it for interpretation because since there are 2 views, so maybe कुछ लोग वैसा भी बोलते हैं कि HUF cannot, since specifically अगर मैं देखूँ तो वो relative के definition में नहीं आता है. Relative का अगर definition Companies Act के अंदर देखें तो it is not falling under that definition, but there is a view that can be taken. Also, if it is being received by a private company, from its director or shareholder from its own funds, then in that case वैसे लोन को मैं deposit नहीं बोलूंगी. Commonly जो company to company होता है, that is also excluded under the exceptions for public deposits. So these kinds of deposits are actually exempted, and these are ways wherein money can flow into the company. Secured bonds अगर मैं इशू करती हूँ, CCBs या CCDs इशू करती हूँ, अगर मिनिमम सब्सक्रिप्शन 1 करोड़ का है तो सिक्योर्ड होना भी जरूरी नहीं है. इट कैन बी अनसिक्योर्ड and it has to have a minimum maturity of 1 year. All these are different instruments which are not treated as deposit, and these are ways in which funds can be raised by an NBFC. So deposit regulation for a normal company is under section 73 of the Companies Act. For NBFC it is because वहां से वो exempt है, तो उसको जो NBFC का deposit regulations है, master direction है, वो follow करना होता है. Moving ahead, asset classification and provisioning requirement. I think most of us are aware क्योंकि हम लोग ये करते आ रहे हैं. And these prudential norms are exempted for companies that are not having access to public funds. So ये मैं तभी देखूंगी अगर मेरा पब्लिक फंड्स है, तो इन दैट केस कोई भी अगर मेरे लोन एसेट्स हैं या कोई भी क्रेडिट फैसिलिटी जो मैंने दी है उसको मेरे को क्लासिफाई करना होगा इन टर्म्स ऑफ इट्स डेज पास्ट ड्यू. नाउ नवंबर में एक ये सर्कुलर आया था आरबीआई का, जहां पे अगेन विच इज अ केस ऑफ कंसर्न, क्योंकि उसमें एक क्लैरिफिकेशन ऐसा आया, आरबीआई ने बोला कि यू हैव टू डू डे एंड प्रोसेसिंग. मतलब ऐसा नहीं हो कि मंथ के एंड में आप देखो कि कितना उसका ड्यू डेट था एंड ड्यूरिंग द मंथ भी अगर पैसे आ गए तो ठीक है, वो स्टैंडर्ड ही है. यू हैव टू डू द प्रोसेसिंग एवरी डे. तो एवरी डे एंड पे ऐसे देखना कि अगर 10th को उसका ड्यू डेट था, 11th तक नहीं आया तो 1 डीपीडी हो गया, 12th तक नहीं आया तो 2 डीपीडी. तो एवरी डे प्रोसेसिंग होगा. एंड ऑल्सो एक और चीज जो इम्पोर्टेंट थी, एक बार अगर एक एसेट एनपीए हो जाता है, तो एनपीए का मतलब क्या है, फॉर अ लार्जर कंपनी इट इज 90 डे, अभी स्मॉलर कंपनीज के लिए 180 डेज है. तो अगर मैं एक बार कंसिडर करती हूँ, समझ लीजिए अगर 90 डेज के बाद वो एनपीए हो गया है, वापस से उसको स्टैंडर्ड लाने के लिए उसको वापस से 0 डीपीडी होना पड़ेगा. यानी कि उसके जितने भी आउटस्टैंडिंग अमाउंट्स है, इट हैज टू पे ऑल ऑफ इट बिफोर इट इज अगेन क्लासिफाइड एज अ स्टैंडर्ड. सो इट कैन नॉट हैपन, जैसे बहुत बार होता था कि 3 इंस्टॉलमेंट्स मंथली इंस्टॉलमेंट्स होते, तो 3 इंस्टॉलमेंट्स नहीं पे किया तब 90 डेज बाद मैं एनपीए बोलती थी. एंड कोई भी एक इंस्टॉलमेंट अगर वो पे कर देता था, वो 60 डीपीडी में आ गया, तो आई वुड हैव सेड कि वो स्टैंडर्ड हो गया, मतलब वो एनपीए नहीं रहा. बट दैट इज नो लॉन्गर द केस. Once it becomes an NPA, to bring back to standard position, I have to ensure कि उसका सारा जितना भी outstanding है, it pays it off and it comes back to 0 DPD. Only then will I be able to classify it as a standard account. Fair practice code again is important only for those NBFCs जिनका कस्टमर इंटरफेस है, यानी कि जो रिटेल लेंडिंग या लोन प्रोडक्ट्स ऑफर करते हैं. अगर वैसा कोई आपका क्लाइंट होगा तो उस केस में उनको देखना होगा कि उनका लोन प्रोसेस, लोन एप्लीकेशन, लोन अग्रीमेंट, all of this is actually in compliance with the fair lending practices that an NBFC must adhere to. Now this is important. किस केस में मेरे को आरबीआई के पास जाना होगा? ऐसे तो मेरी कंपनी चल रही है तो मेरे को रोज रोज आरबीआई के पास नहीं जाना होता है. स्मॉलर एनबीएफसीज का जो रिपोर्टिंग रिक्वायरमेंट भी है, इट इज जस्ट ऑन एन एनुअल बेसिस जो मेरे को रिपोर्टिंग करना होता है, तो मैं आरबीआई के पास ऐसे भी नहीं जाना चाहूंगी. बट किस केस में हो सकता है मेरे को जाना पड़ जाए? अगर ऐसा कोई चेंज हो रहा है मेरे मैनेजमेंट में विच इज मोर देन 30% ऑफ माई एग्जिस्टिंग डायरेक्टर्स. तो अगर कंपनी में 3 डायरेक्टर्स है एंड एक और डायरेक्टर आ रहा है, तो 1/3 इट इज मोर देन 30% एंड वुड रिक्वायर प्रायर अप्रूवल फ्रॉम आरबीआई. हाउएवर अगर कंपनी में 4 डायरेक्टर होते और एक और आ रहा होता, तो 1/4 वुड बी जस्ट 25% एंड इट वुड नॉट हैव रिक्वायर्ड prior approval from RBI. The intent of RBI is in terms of change in management कि कोई भी नए बंदे को अगर आप ला रहे हो, मैनेजमेंट में आप चेंज कर रहे हैं, वेदर वो फिट एंड प्रॉपर है या नहीं है, ये मेरे से कंफर्म करवाइए आप, बिकॉज आई हैव टू सी दैट जिसको भी आप ला रहे हैं, वेदर ही हैज सफिशिएंट क्वालिफिकेशन एंड एक्सपीरियंस टू बी ऑन द बोर्ड ऑफ एन एनबीएफसी और नॉट. सो दैट इज द रीजन आरबीआई सेज कि अगर कभी भी मैनेजमेंट में 30% से ज्यादा चेंज हो रहा है, so you get it approved by the RBI. In terms of shareholding, again अगर आपका shareholding 26% से ज्यादा ट्रांसफर हो रहा है या कोई नया एक्वायर कर रहा है, so in that case also you need to take the prior approval from RBI. मतलब शेयर होल्डिंग चेंज में तो लेना ही है, तो टेक ओवर और एक्विजिशन यानी कि जो हम लोग एनबीएफसी बेचते हैं बहुत बार, या फिर उस केस में मतलब ये भी एक बहुत कॉमन क्वेश्चन आता है कि मैं एक नई एनबीएफसी खरीदूं, मतलब नई एनबीएफसी बनाऊं या फिर एक एग्जिस्टिंग एनबीएफसी खरीदूं। बहुत बार जो एनबीएफसी बिजनेस में आना चाहते हैं या उनको एक एनबीएफसी चाहिए अपने ग्रुप में, तो वो बोलते हैं कि मैं एक नई एनबीएफसी नई कंपनी बना के उसके लिए अप्लाई करूं, या फिर मैं एक एग्जिस्टिंग जो एनबीएफसी है उसी को खरीद लूं। तो अब इसमें क्या आता है कि अगर मैं एक एग्जिस्टिंग एनबीएफसी को खरीदने का या टेक ओवर करने का सोचती हूँ, तो इन दैट केस ऑल्सो आई हैव टू गो टू द आरबीआई, मतलब वो जो अप्रूवल प्रोसेस है वो उस केस में भी रहेगा, मेरे को आरबीआई के पास जाना होगा। वो जो आरबीआई का स्क्रूटनी है इज इक्वल, मतलब वहां पे भी वो देखता है कि कौन खरीदने वाला है, उसका फिर पूरा पास ट्रैक रिकॉर्ड, उसका बैंकर्स रिपोर्ट, सिविल रिपोर्ट, एवरीथिंग जो भी एक नए एनबीएफसी को बनाने के लिए मेरे को शेयर होल्डर्स और डायरेक्टर्स का देना होता है, वही मेरे को चेंज इन कंट्रोल के लिए भी देना होता है। सो द प्रोसेस रिमेन्स द सेम, जस्ट दैट अगर आप एग्जिस्टिंग एनबीएफसी खरीदते हैं तो उसका पूरा कचरा जो भी पुराना है उसके साथ हो जाता है, and नई NBFC it is a fresh slate to start with and you can maybe commence your fresh operations on that. So now that depends कि आप अच्छे proper अगर due diligence और भी करके आप ले रहे हैं, so you can fair in मतलब you can maybe acquire an existing NBFC itself, but if you want a fresh NBFC in that case I have to see कि मैं उस केस में भी मेरे को जो एप्लीकेशन करना होता है उसमें भी मेरा 6 महीना मिनिमम लग ही जाता है, क्योंकि आरबीआई से वापस क्वेरीज आते हैं, we have to revert, so that takes time. Similarly, it will be the case if I'm taking over an NBFC. So these prior approval norms are applicable for change in shareholding and management. In certain cases, if I am I'm also required to give a prior notice in the newspaper, वो takeover और उसके लिए ही applicable है। LRM norms now these were recently introduced लास्ट ईयर, तो उसके इस मतलब लिक्विडिटी रिस्क मैनेजमेंट नेम से ही पता चल रहा है कि हाल फिलहाल में आरबीआई को रिस्क मैनेजमेंट रिलेटेड जो कंसर्न्स है आरबीआई में वो ज्यादा हैं, पास में जो भी केसेस हो रखे हैं उसकी वजह से। सो लिक्विडिटी रिस्क मैनेजमेंट इज व्हाट आई हैव टू इंश्योर दैट आई एम, पहली बात तो इसका एप्लीकेबिलिटी सिर्फ तभी है जब मेरा 100 करोड़ से ऊपर है एसेट साइज, एंड इफ आई एम नॉट हैविंग पब्लिक फंड्स और कस्टमर इंटरफेस, इन दैट केस आई एम एक्सक्लूडेड। तो अगर ये दोनों नहीं है मेरा, मतलब 100 करोड़ से ऊपर है या तो मेरा पब्लिक फंड या कस्टमर इंटरफेस है, देन आई हैव टू कंप्लाई विद एलआरएम फ्रेमवर्क। इसके लिए मेरे को क्या करना होगा, ये जो इंटरनल बोर्ड अप्रूवल या मॉनिटरिंग जो करना होता है, या तो रिस्क मैनेजमेंट कमेटी करती है या बोर्ड डायरेक्ट करता है, तो मेरे को अपने एसेट्स और लाइबिलिटी का मिसमैच होने से बचाना है। सो आई हैव टू सी दीज आर प्रॉपर्ली मैनेज्ड। हाउ डू आई इंश्योर दैट? आई हैव टू कैटेगराइज देम इनटू बकेट्स। तो मैं एक एक बकेट्स में उनको डालती हूँ कि मेरा 30 डेज के अंदर क्या लाइबिलिटी मैच्योर होने वाला है, और 30 डेज के अंदर मेरे पास क्या फंड्स है जो लिक्विड है, जो एसेट्स है जो लिक्विड है, तो ये एनफ है वो लाइबिलिटी मीट करने के लिए या नहीं। पहले तो ये 30 डेज का एक बकेट था, फिर 30 to 60। अब क्या आरबीआई बोल रहा है कि मेरे को ये जो ग्रेन्युलैरिटी है वो और छोटी करनी है, तो 30 डेज के विद इन भी आप स्मॉल ग्रैन्युलर बकेट्स बनाइए, 1 से 7 डेज, 8 to 14 डेज, 15 to 30 डेज। इसमें भी अगर कोई आपका लाइबिलिटी मैच्योर होने वाला है, उससे उसके अगेंस्ट आपके पास प्रॉपर एसेट्स है या नहीं है, वो आपको इंश्योर करनी है। So that has to be, the bucketing has to be done, the committee has to be formed which is ensuring that these bucketing and everything is being done, and reporting। अब इसी के अंदर एक disclosure requirement है जहाँ पे मेरा कितना liabilities है, कितने percentage है, it is prescribed, it has to be disclosed on the website अगर कंपनी का है तो, नहीं है तो financials का तो पार्ट बनना ही है। तो मेरा जो financials बनेगा, annual financials, इन कंपनीज के लिए आपको स्पेसिफिकली ध्यान रखना है कि वो जो LRM के अंदर डिस्क्लोजर है वो भी पार्ट बने मेरे फाइनेंशियल स्टेटमेंट्स का। दिस इज एप्लीकेबल फॉर दिस ईयर इटसेल्फ। सो अभी का भी अगर कोई फाइनेंशियल्स फाइनल आप कर रहे हैं तो उसमें भी इन कंपनीज जिनके ऊपर एलआरएम एप्लीकेबल है वहां पे वो डिस्क्लोजर होना चाहिए। Other several requirements, policy and all may not be very much relevant information with respect to change in address of directors, auditors, ये सब intimate करने का requirement है। If I become systemically important, मतलब मेरा 500 करोड़ से ऊपर हो जाता है तो immediately मेरे को कुछ एक कमिटीज फॉर्म करनी पड़ेगी, फिट एंड प्रॉपर क्राइटेरिया, कॉर्पोरेट गवर्नेंस के जो भी नॉर्म्स है जो बड़ी एनबीएफसीज के ऊपर एप्लीकेबल, दैट बिकम्स एप्लीकेबल। These are list of policies, some of which may not be applicable on all NBFCs, but these are general list of policies that a small NBFC also needs to ensure कि वो adopt करके वो कर रहे हैं। स्नैपशॉट में अगर हम देखें, आर फोकस बीइंग ऑन नॉन सिस्टमिकली इंपॉर्टेंट कंपनीज, कॉन्सेंट्रेशन नॉर्म्स नहीं एप्लीकेबल, कैपिटल एडिक्वेसी नहीं है एप्लीकेबल, प्रोविजनिंग नॉर्म्स भी सिर्फ तभी एप्लीकेबल होगा जब मेरे पास पब्लिक फंड्स है, एसेट क्लासिफिकेशन भी तभी एप्लीकेबल होगा, स्टैट्यूटरी ऑडिटर का सर्टिफिकेट इन ऑल केसेस एप्लीकेबल है, लेवरेज रेशियो अगर मेरे पास पब्लिक फंड्स नहीं है तो नहीं एप्लीकेबल है, नहीं तो वो भी एप्लीकेबल होगा बिकॉज दैट इज ऑल्सो कमिंग अंडर द प्रूडेंशियल नॉर्म्स इटसेल्फ। देन कॉर्पोरेट गवर्नेंस वाले एप्लीकेबल नहीं होते स्मॉलर एनबीएफसीज पे, केवाईसी भी सिर्फ कस्टमर इंटरफेस है तभी एप्लीकेबल होगा, एंड सेम विद सीआईसी रिपोर्टिंग। These are the various reportings that are required. FIU जो मैंने आपको बताया है ताकि वो इंश्योर कर लीजिएगा for all NBFCs to avoid being classified as a defaulting company. CKYC and CICs, these are applicable only if you are having customer interface. NESL के पास या SRSI के पास भी मतलब most of the smaller NBFCs may not require. And RBI का जो reporting requirements है, which is XBRL reporting requirement, पहले तो NBS forms होते थे, NBS 8 and 9, आजकल DNBS कर दिया RBI ने, तो पूरा XBRL में shift हो गया उसका भी reporting requirement. And the reporting requirement has actually been very extensive, तो उसमें जिस हिसाब का disclosures RBI मांग रहे हैं, तो that is very extensive, बहुत सारे disclosures उसने इसमें include कर दिए हैं. So this is the DNBS 02 जो कि NBS 7 जो था पहले उसको रिप्लेस कर रहा है. शॉर्ट टर्म डायनामिक लिक्विडिटी वाला जो था क्वार्टरली या मंथली बेसिस पे. नाउ दिस इज एप्लीकेबल ओनली इफ यू हैव एन एसेट साइज ऑफ मोर देन 100 crore, नॉट अदरवाइज. एंड स्टैट्यूटरी ऑडिटर सर्टिफिकेट का रिक्वायरमेंट जो है दैट इज एप्लीकेबल ऑन ऑल एनबीएफसीज ऑन एन एनुअल बेसिस. ODI और FDI norms, FDI वाले जो फॉर्म्स रिटर्न्स भी होते हैं, दैट इज ऑल्सो एप्लीकेबल ओनली इन केस यू हैव दैट in your company. Major concerns area के पहले maybe let us just move to the appointment of auditor guidelines. I think given the paucity of time, I think first वो cover कर लेते हैं because that is important. ये last year introduce हुआ था guidelines on appointment of auditor. So अभी तक Companies Act के अंदर we were appointing auditors for a period of 5 years. Now RBI came up with this कि नहीं auditor appointment सिर्फ Companies Act के अंदर क्यों govern होगा, NBFCs को मैं regulate करता हूँ, तो I will also bring up a guidelines for appointment of auditors. This is not just for banks but also NBFCs. Now applicability अगर हम इसका देखें तो RBI ने बोला था कि applicable होगा सिर्फ उन्हीं NBFCs पे जिनका 1000 crore से ऊपर है asset size. So only those NBFCs which have an asset size of more than 1000 crores will actually look into this guidelines. But फिर last year RBI ने mails भेजने start कर दिए थे even smaller NBFCs को, क्योंकि वहां पे जो RBI का गाइडलाइन था वहां पे एक छोटा सा लिखा हुआ था कि एक फॉर्म ए का जो रिक्वायरमेंट है दैट हैज टू बी satisfied by all NBFCs. So that is a requirement that has to be complied with by all NBFCs, that they have to submit this form A within 1 month of appointment of director. तो even smaller NBFCs जिनका मतलब 1000 crore से कम है उनको भी फिर ये चीज अप्लाई करेगा and they have to report to RBI in the prescribed format which is form A. अब ये जो गाइडलाइंस आए थे इसमें जो मेजर चीजें चेंज हुई थी which is different from what was being followed. एक तो the tenure of appointment of an auditor. Audit firm can be appointed for a period of 5 years or 10 years consecutive under the Companies Act. Under the new regulation, मतलब अगर आप एक NBFC हैं तो in that case you can be appointed only for a period of 3 years and उसके बाद 6 साल का cooling period. तो वो जो tenure 5 साल का था उसको कट करके 3 years का कर दिया गया for NBFCs and also banks. अभी हम लोग because NBFCs पे फोकस कर रहे हैं. Also एक और चीज जो इसमें आई थी कि कितने NBFCs का एक ऑडिट फर्म ऑडिट कर सकता है at a point of time. तो it has to be only 8 NBFCs. इसको लेकर कंफ्यूजन था पहले, फिर RBI ने अपने FAQs में भी क्लैरिफाई कर दिया. जब मैं ये 8 कंप्यूट करूंगी तो इट इज नॉट जस्ट 1000 करोड़ से ऊपर NBFCs but all regulated entities. तो इवन 1000 करोड़ से कम वाली NBFCs इस 8 के कंप्यूटेशन में आ जाएगी. तो आप एज एन ऑडिटर आज के दिन सिर्फ 8 NBFCs का ऑडिट कर सकते हैं and in a financial year, and that 8 NBFCs includes both less than 1000 crores as well as more than 1000 crores. So even if it is a smaller NBFC जिसके ऊपर ये guidelines ही applicable नहीं है, but वो जो computation है number of audits का 8 audits का, उसमें even those NBFCs will be included. So this was a major change. इसको लेकर बहुत issues भी हो रहे हैं मतलब auditors के भी, and representations have also been made to the RBI, but अभी तक इसको लेकर कोई भी change, amendment या clarification नहीं आया है. So as on date, this is the position कि as an auditor you cannot do the audit of more than 8 NBFCs, including smaller NBFCs of less than 1,000 crore asset size. And every year, एक बार तो आपका अपॉइंटमेंट हो गया 3 साल के पीरियड के लिए. Every year the audit committee और the board वो आपका जो eligibility है उसको वापस reassess करेगा. हर साल आपसे eligibility का सर्टिफिकेट भी लेगा, and उसके reassessment के बाद मतलब पहले जो वो concept था पुराने कंपनीज एक्ट में ratification होता था ऑडिटर का, वो तो हटा दिया कंपनीज एक्ट में, बट यहाँ पे RBI ने एक sort of ratification ही ला दिया, क्योंकि every year वो ऑडिट कमिटी या बोर्ड को देखना होगा कि आप इंडिपेंडेंस आपका फुलफिल हो रहा है कि नहीं, और मीटिंग द एलिजिबिलिटी क्राइटेरिया और नॉट, एंड इफ दैट इज बीइंग इंश्योर्ड देन यू हैव टू रिपोर्ट टू द आरबीआई इन द सेम फॉर्मेट ऑफ फॉर्म ए. सो वो आपको हर साल रिपोर्ट करना होगा. प्रायर अप्रूवल जैसा कुछ रिक्वायरमेंट नहीं है एनबीएफसीज के लिए, इट इज जस्ट इंटीमेशन, वो भी 1 month फ्रॉम द डेट ऑफ अपॉइंटमेंट या रैटिफिकेशन जो भी हो रहा है, एंड इट हैज टू बी अ पीरियड ऑफ 3 years. आफ्टर दैट 2 टर्म यानी 6 साल का वो कूलिंग पीरियड है जिसमें आप नहीं हो सकते. अच्छा, इट इज नॉट जस्ट दिस, इसके अलावा भी कुछ एक रेस्ट्रिक्शन है, बिकॉज अगर आप एक कंपनी का ऑडिट कर रहे हैं तो उस कंपनी के ऑडिट करने के 1 साल पहले और 1 साल बाद तक आप उसके किसी ग्रुप कंपनी का ऑडिट नहीं कर सकते, उसको कोई और नॉन ऑडिट सर्विस नहीं दे सकते टू द ग्रुप कंपनी और टू दैट एनबीएफसी आल्सो. मतलब आप जिस कंपनी का ऑडिटर मतलब ऑडिट कर रहे हैं, आप जिस कंपनी में ऑडिटर हैं फॉर अ पीरियड ऑफ 3 years, उसके 1 साल पहले और 1 साल बाद, अपॉइंटमेंट के 1 साल पहले और 1 साल बाद, मतलब ये जो 1 साल का पीरियड है उसमें आप ना ही कोई नॉन ऑडिट सर्विस दे सकते हैं उस एनबीएफसी को, या उसके ग्रुप एंटिटीज को आप ऑडिट एज वेल एज नॉन ऑडिट नहीं दे सकते. यहाँ पे ग्रुप एंटिटीज आरबीआई ने क्लैरिफाई किया था अपने एफएक्यूज में कि वो रेगुलेटेड एंटिटीज ही होंगे जिनको आप नहीं दे सकते. अनरेगुलेटेड को आप दे सकते हैं प्रोवाइडेड वहां पे कोई कॉन्फ्लिक्ट ऑफ इंटरेस्ट नहीं. तो अगर कोई कॉन्फ्लिक्ट ऑफ इंटरेस्ट नहीं है, और कॉन्फ्लिक्ट ऑफ इंटरेस्ट भी जो 138 के अंदर प्रिस्क्राइब्ड है, जैसे टैक्स ऑडिट सर्विस आप करते हैं, तो दीज आर सर्विसेज व्हिच इज नॉट अ कॉन्फ्लिक्ट ऑफ इंटरेस्ट. अगर कोई स्टैट्यूटरी रिक्वायरमेंट है जिसके अंदर आपको सर्टिफिकेशन करके देना है, सो दीज आर नॉट services which have any conflict of interest, and this can be provided. However, non-audit and audit service to group entities, regulated entities, as well as non-audit service to that particular NBFC itself cannot be provided 1 year before and 1 year after the appointment. Operational, this was no conflict of interest or independence का जो criteria. अच्छा, someone was asking group का definition, ये जो यहाँ पे दिया हुआ यही है जो आरबीआई के हर जगह पे लिखा हुआ है. Subsidiary, joint venture, associate, promoter, promotee, it is applicable for listed companies, related party, common brand name, and investment in equity of more than 20%. So this is the definition of group company that RBI prescribes wherever it has to ensure कि वो regulations सिर्फ NBFC नहीं, उसके group companies को भी फॉलो करने पड़े, या मेरे को देखना है किस हद तक मेरा इंटरेक्शन हो रहा है ग्रुप एंटिटीज के साथ. सो दीज आर द एंटिटीज व्हिच विल गेट कवर्ड अंडर दैट डेफिनेशन. अपार्ट फ्रॉम दैट, लास्ट ईयर मोस्टली जिन कंपनीज में ऐसा था कि ऑलरेडी ऑडिटर बहुत साल से चले आ रहे हैं, तो दे वुड हैव बिकम इनएलिजिबल फॉर फर्दर अपॉइंटमेंट. वो चेंज हुआ होगा, अगर नहीं हुआ हो तो वेकेट हुआ होगा इस साल फिर ऑफिस. And I would have to ensure that अगर मेरा already 1 year या 2 year उस कंपनी में हो चुका था, तो only for that remaining tenure I will be reappointed, and that also subject to fulfilling the eligibility criteria जो कि RBI का prescribed है. I think these are the basic मतलब ये जो comparison हम लोग ने किया था कि क्योंकि since companies act के अंदर already था regulations for अपॉइंटमेंट ऑफ ऑडिटर, उसमें और जो आरबीआई गाइडलाइंस आए थे थोड़ा बहुत डिफरेंस थे. तो अब एनबीएफसी कैसे उसको कंप्लाई करेगी, तो एनबीएफसी को दे हैव टू ऑलवेज इंश्योर दैट द स्ट्रिक्टर गाइडलाइंस विल बी एप्लीकेबल एंड द स्ट्रिक्टर प्रोविजंस विल बिकम एप्लीकेबल. तो कंपनीज एक्ट के अंदर इवन दो 5 years अलाउड है, बट आरबीआई गाइडलाइंस के अंदर सिंस ओनली 3 years अलाउड है, तो मेरे को 3 years के लिए सिर्फ अपॉइंट करना है. 6 years का वो जो ये है टाइम गैप है वो रहेगा. Individual auditor versus audit firm guidelines के हिसाब से only a audit firm can be appointed as the auditor for a NBFC और मतलब for RBI regulated entities. तो वहाँ पे जो requirement है eligibility condition है उसमें दिया हुआ है कि it can only be a firm. कुछ देर पहले किसी ने ये भी पूछा था कि proprietorship firm will be considered as a firm. No, it will not be considered. It is just a partnership and LLP. वो भी RBI में लिखा है. तो ईयरली रैटिफिकेशन का जो रिक्वायरमेंट है पहले कंपनीज एक्ट में जो था वो हटा दिया गया था, बट सिंस आरबीआई ने वापस लिया है तो वो वापस रहेगा कि एवरी ईयर आई हैव टू सी दैट आई एम फुलफिलिंग दीज एलिजिबिलिटी रिक्वायरमेंट्स. मैक्सिमम नंबर ऑफ ऑडिट्स जो मैं कर सकता हूँ ओनली 8 एनबीएफसीज. बैंक्स का भी ऑडिट पे वो रेस्ट्रिक्शन है, बट आई एम नाउ राइट नाउ फोकसिंग ओनली ऑन कितने एनबीएफसीज का मैं ऑडिट कर सकता हूँ, व्हिच इज 8. बोर्ड अप्रूव पॉलिसी होना चाहिए आरबीआई गाइडलाइंस के अंदर. एंड ब्रांच ऑडिट का जो रिक्वायरमेंट है कि टॉप 10-20 ब्रांचेस या टॉप 20% ऑफ द ब्रांचेस एटलीस्ट कवर करने इन केस एनबीएफसी के ब्रांचेस हो तो, व्हिच इज रेयर. अब प्रेजेंटेशन वाइज इतना ही था. नाउ मे बी इफ देयर आर क्वेश्चंस तो वो ले सकते हैं. Is registration mandatory under NESL SERSAI? As I mentioned, NESL का जो पर्सपेक्टिव था आने का, इंट्रोड्यूस करने का, that was because IBC के अंदर, तो IBC के अंदर अगर आप किसी के ऊपर इंसॉल्वेंसी या बैंक्रप्सी का केस करना चाहते हैं तो उस केस में NESL में जो रजिस्टर्ड होगा डेट रिलेटेड इंफॉर्मेशन उसको प्रायोरिटी मिलेगा. तो वो क्योंकि सिंस इट हैज ऑलरेडी बीन रजिस्टर्ड विद द आयु इंफॉर्मेशन यूटिलिटी, तो इंसॉल्वेंसी के केस में आपके क्लेम को वो प्रायोरिटी मिलेगा. सो इट इज, आई वुड से इट इज मैंडेटरी. अगर आप NESL से जाके पूछेंगे, आयु से जाके पूछेंगे तो वो तो बोलेगा यस ऑल डेट शुड बी फाइल्ड. बट अब आप देखिए कि अगर आप किसी इंडिविजुअल को लोन दे रहे हैं तो इंडिविजुअल का तो अभी तक बैंक्रप्सी जो नॉर्म्स है रेगुलेशन है वही नोटिफाई नहीं हुआ. सो इट इज सॉर्ट ऑफ यू कैन से रिक्वायरमेंट जो कि मेरे लिए मॉनेटरी टर्म्स में भी मेरे को रजिस्टर करने के लिए खर्च करना पड़ता है एंड उसका जब भी मैं फाइलिंग करूंगी तब भी. सो सेवरल एनबीएफसीज थिंक दैट दैट इज नॉट रिक्वायर्ड बिकॉज मे बी दे विल नॉट प्रोसीड अगेंस्ट दैट. ऑल्सो अगर मैं अनसिक्योर्ड क्रेडिटर हूँ तब तो और कोई सेंस नहीं बनता, मेरा प्रायोरिटी लिस्ट में ऐसे भी बहुत नीचे आएगा ना. एंड सरसाई में रजिस्ट्रेशन का तभी रिक्वायरमेंट है अगर मैं कोई किसी टाइप का सिक्योरिटी इंटरेस्ट भी क्रिएट करती हूँ while I'm lending. So if I'm lending to an entity जहाँ पे मैं security interest create कर रही हूँ like mortgage or something, those have to be registered with the SARFAI. 5-year term of appointment of auditor completed in 2022. So do we have to appoint new auditor? Yes, you will have to appoint a new auditor because this auditor has already exceeded the requirement of 3 years. So now you will have to appoint a new auditor in the company.
May I have one question, please?
Yes, yes, sir.
किसी कंपनी ने कोई पर्पस के लिए कंपनी बनाई थी, दे आर हैविंग से 2 crores एज ए पेड अप कैपिटल एंड द पर्पस ऑफ द कंपनी इज नॉट सर्व्ड, सो नाउ दे आर यूजिंग दैट फंड फॉर इन्वेस्टमेंट इन म्यूचुअल फंड्स एंड शेयर्स, बट दे हैव नॉट रजिस्टर्ड विद RBI as such, NBFC. As an auditor, what you should do? They say that this is a temporary investment, and as and when we get an opportunity for good business, we'll go for the business. So temporarily, we are using this fund for investment in mutual fund, but that temporary period is already 5 years has gone. So, as an auditor, what one should do?
As an auditor, sir, you are in a risky position now because अगर 5 years हो चुके हैं, so I cannot say that this is a temporary phase.
Yeah.
If already, मतलब एक होता है कि yes, I understand कि बहुत बार जैसे कि मैंने ये example
संदीप लॉग ऑफ हो गया लगता है उनका.
Tell. Yes, I think so.
Let's wait for a couple of minutes till they come.
I'm telling. बाय मिस्टेक लोगो हो गए, बात कर रहा हूँ।
प्लीज अलाउ टू अनम्यूट, वो कह रही है, एक बार अनम्यूट करो उनको।
Yes, you may unmute now.
Yeah, I'm extremely sorry. Technical error की वजह से
Yeah,
laptop
Yes,
बंद हो गया।
yes,
So sorry.
fine. Please go ahead. Yeah, it's okay. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think we were just talking about that position wherein एक कंपनी में टेम्पररी पर्पस के लिए अपने फंड्स को इन्वेस्ट कर दिया है। तो इन दैट केस इट, मतलब कोविड के टाइम पे आई वाज जस्ट गिविंग एन एग्जांपल कि ये बहुत ही मतलब बहुत ही कॉमन सिचुएशन था जहाँ पे बहुत सारी कंपनीज के पास टेम्पररी फंड्स थे एंड दे हैड टू इन्वेस्ट इट इन सम, मतलब दे कुड नॉट हैव केप्ट इट आइडल, तो वो सरप्लस फंड्स को कहीं ना कहीं इन्वेस्ट ही करेंगे एंड म्यूचुअल फंड्स या शेयर सिक्योरिटीज में इन्वेस्ट करना सबसे मतलब कॉमन वो था। बट नाउ दैट आई हैव टू सी दैट इट हैज टू बी अ टेम्पररी फेज। आई कैन नॉट से दैट मोर देन 5 years अगर मैं कर रही हूँ एंड आई एम अनेबल टू डिसाइड कि मेरा क्या बिजनेस होगा एक्चुअल जिसमें मैं इन्वेस्ट करूंगी, so that cannot be said to be temporary and the auditors must raise that concern in its audit report.
Thank you, Anita ji, on this. One more query related to an NBFC. Under IBC, NBFCs cannot be, in companies which are NBFCs, we cannot file an application against them. One of the banks, they had lent to a company and the corporate guarantor was another company which was in the year 2013 an NBFC. But presently we are not able to figure out what is the current status of that company, whether that is an NBFC or not. Even in the RBI website, if we go through the list of the companies, it is not getting reflected there. So what is the best course to figure out whether that company is still an NBFC or not?
नहीं तो as on date if you are saying that list of NBFCs जो RBI populate करता है from time to time, if it is not being shown as an NBFC as on date,
yes,
but you are saying कि जब ये केस हुआ था, मतलब जिस दिन का डिफॉल्ट का बात हो रहा है, at that point of time it was an NBFC,
right?
बहुत ही मतलब वैसा मैटर हो गया कि मतलब मे बी ये आई थिंक इसका ना एक सिमिलर मैटर ये जो आप बोल रहे हैं इसका एक केस भी हुआ हुआ है ऑलरेडी व्हिच आई करेंटली मे नॉट रिकॉल, बट ये ऐसा हुआ हुआ कि द पोजीशन ऑफ एन एनबीएफसी, मतलब इसका वाइस वर्सा हुआ था कि एट द पॉइंट ऑफ टाइम जब डिफॉल्ट हुआ था और वो एनबीएफसी नहीं थी एंड व्हेन एक्चुअली जब केस हुआ तब वो एनबीएफसी थी, मतलब इट गॉट रजिस्टर्ड एज एन एनबीएफसी, तो उसको वो मिलेगा कि नहीं, तो ऐसा हुआ है। बट आई डोंट रिकॉल कि उसमें एक्चुअल मतलब कोर्ट ने क्या स्टैंड लिया था। This maybe we'll have to maybe check.
Is it possible to go to RBI and get the status update on what that company is real
हाँ,
status?
RBI तो लिस्ट निकालते रहते हैं ना NBFCs का from time to time.
नहीं, लिस्ट में नहीं पता चल रहा, बट RBI जाके वहां पे पता चल सकते हैं क्या?
RBI पहली बात तो आज के डेट में अगर हम सोचे कि मैं ऐसे RBI चली जाऊं और वहां पे वो लोग मेरे को एंटरटेन करेंगे तो that is not the scenario because वो लोग बिना अपॉइंटमेंट के एंट्री भी नहीं देते हैं।
नहीं, वो बैंक के ऑफिशियल्स ही जाएंगे उसमें एट द सीनियर लेवल।
हाँ, अगर बैंक के ऑफिशियल्स के थ्रू आप पता, बट मतलब आई थिंक जब लिस्ट मेरे पास है तो मैं वहां पे जाके क्यों पता करूंगी, मतलब अगर मेरे पास कंपनी का नाम है तो आरबीआई के साइट पे सारे अपडेटेड लिस्ट है। लास्ट जो अपडेट हुआ था आई थिंक अप्रैल में अपडेटेड है, तो वो वहां से ही पता चल जाएगा। बट इन एनी केस इफ यू वांट टू बी डबल मतलब कंफर्म करना है आपको वैसे, उस केस में आप आरबीआई में जाके भी पता कर सकते हैं। बट यही आप जाएंगे तो हो सकता है वो एंटरटेन नहीं करे, बैंक ऑफिशियल्स जाके अगर पूछे तो।
राइट, थैंक यू।
I cannot read the chat, so if there were any further questions, because मेरा log out हो गया था, तो कोई अगर और questions थे, तो maybe someone
No
can.
further questions in the chat box, but if any other participant wants to have any other query, they can raise that question now. No further questions, Sandeep?
Well, I think it's a Sunday, so maybe इसलिए further questions नहीं है.
I think your explanations were very exhaustive, so I think they
Yeah.
would have got answers to all their queries. One question has been raised on the chat box. Can an auditor be appointed for 2 NBFCs of same group?
So you are saying that an एक ही auditor को मैं same group के 2 NBFCs में appoint कर सकता हूँ कि नहीं? तो
Right.
यहाँ पे जो restriction था, if I see कि there was a restriction with respect to appointment of the same auditor in the group entities before and after 1 year, I cannot provide audit or non-audit service. But regulations में ऐसा बोला गया है कि during the audit tenure, if you intend to provide any service to the group entities which is not conflict of interest, तो अगर मैं audit service दे रही हूँ, तो of course that is not a conflict of interest because दोनों जगह मैं audit ही कर रही हूँ. So if that is the scenario, then yes, you can at the same point of time be appointed as the auditor of 2 NBFCs of the same group.
Right.
So there is no further question, I think. In that case, thank you, Anita ji, for the wonderful deliberation. I would like to request our secretary, C. Dheeraj Agarwal, for formal board of thanks.
Thank you, Sandeep, for this wonderful opportunity. And Anita ji, NBFC is a topic which is quite complicated for most of us. And you have, in a very simple manner and in an elaborate manner, covered the aspects about the NBFCs. And even on a Sunday morning, you have taken time out for us, for VVIPs. So thanks a lot for that. And we do hope to continue to receive your deliberations and your inputs from time to time. So thanks a lot, and our sincere gratitude to you for consenting to be the guest speaker today. On behalf of us, a hearty vote of thanks to you. And on behalf of the WIPCA, a small token of appreciation in the form of this memento, which we will share with you physically shortly. And so once again, thanks a lot. And will it be possible for you to share your presentation with our participants?
Sure, I'll do that. I'll email it to Rajesh ji so that he can share.
So we'll
sure, definitely. Thanks a lot. This was the first time that I have deliberated over here in the VIP. Staying in Lake Town, I think this gives me an opportunity कि मैं और ज़्यादा interact करूँ. I have a brother who is a chartered accountant, and my mentor, which is Mr. Vinod Kothari, he is also a chartered accountant. But it was a very great experience to be a part of this, and hope to have such deliberations in future as well.
Sure, sure. And do ask your brother if he's still not a member of VIPC Association to become a part
he's
of
there.
our...
He's there. He's already there. I think CA अगर कोई इस area में है और वो member नहीं है, तो he's losing out on a lot of opportunities.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thanks a lot once again.
Thank you everyone.
Thank you everyone
for your participation.
Thank you.
Thank you.